Welcome to episode 8 of An Understanding. This one will be about Martin Van Buren. If you like it, listen. If you don't, you guys can eat biscuits. Otherwise, enjoy. Just picture for just a second that you are Martin Van Buren. Teenager Martin Van Buren living in New York City, late 1700s, early 1800s, okay? You got this opportunity. Your education's been all over the place. Let's just be brutally honest about it. And, you're a pretty intelligent kid, to be honest with you, but you're a little bit behind. And let's just face the facts, unfortunately, for Martin Van Buren's upbringing, for the most part. But you get the opportunity to be a clerk in New York City for a very prominent law firm, a very prominent, most remember Democratic Republican lawyers around that particular time, the Jeffersonian people for the most part. And you work hard, 8 hours a day doing your whatever clerk stuff and etc. And then you study the law at night. And you really put all your heart into this, and you really put all your effort into this, and you want to succeed so badly, and you feel a bunch of different things. You feel happy, and yet you feel so grossly insecure that you overcompensate sometimes. And Martin Van Buren would always have insecurities that would follow him and just continue to bog him for the rest of his life. Education, appearance, etc., etc. I mean, most people who actually get to see a picture of Martin Van Buren, they see all those mutton chop things, and that's just, he had that for a reason, to kind of stand out and be a little bit different. I mean, there's actually a whole bunch of different fundamental reasons. Probably because he's balding too, so, take away from, the reality that he was balding. Very, very fascinating. Anyways, Martin Van Buren is told one day, hey man, you can't be dressing like that. You're not going to go anywhere if you dress like that. And Martin Van Buren just looks at his clothing for a second, and he's just like, my mom made me these clothes. These are homespun clothes, and Martin Van Buren feels really embarrassed by that. He feels really insecure about the fact that he has, homespun clothes, and to him, it's a part of who he is. It's a part of his family, etc., etc. The Dutch family that he would grow up in, and the Dutch county that he would grow up in New York, is really fucking close. I mean, all the Dutch people married all the Dutch people. In fact, it was so Dutch that Martin Van Buren's first language was Dutch. It was not English, it was Dutch. It's just fascinating, where English becomes his second language, technically, in this country's history. And he would have problems writing, let's just be honest. And the translation from Dutch to English, etc., etc. He's a fantastic speaker, but, there would be problems with translation, in fairness. And it would be a problem for him for the rest of his life, which is probably why he and Andrew Jackson got along pretty well, for the most part, because Andrew Jackson would have some phonetic problems that would go along with his life. But you look at your clothes, you're embarrassed. You're in New York City. You think about it this way. You grew up in a really fascinatingly poor, lower middle class kind of family. It's not the rags to riches story that Andrew Jackson was, but, there's some commonalities between you and Jackson. And you going from where you were born to where you grew up and to come to New York City, the glitz, the glamour, the city that made Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, the city that would eventually never sleep. And you feel like an outsider there. You feel like an outcast, and you feel like you have to overcompensate in every single way that you possibly can. And you're pondering to yourself, why am I doing this? Why I could just be happy being a fucking bartender at my dad's tavern. It is what it is. And you're told one day, hey, you know what? You can't keep dressing like that, or you will not succeed in New York. You will not succeed in the eventual political game that you're going to be part of, and the eventual life you want to have. And Martin Van Buren made a couple of interesting choices. First and foremost, he thinks for a second. He's like, what do I want to be? What am I going to choose as the direction of my path and my career, for the most part? Because he does want to be a lawyer. And in fact, he would actually become one of the state's most prominent, dominant lawyers ever, because a lot of people had separate different incomes to be sufficient in their lifestyles. But Martin Van Buren, all he needed to be was a lawyer, and he could make his money. And he was really fucking Gucci at it, And but he ponders, and he thinks to himself, if I dress differently, if I take this away from me, am I giving up, my childhood, etc., my family, my ties, etc., or am I possibly just growing, becoming better? Am I going to basically let my past stop me from achieving what I want? Is my past stopping me because I have such a strong family spirit of where I came from that I'm not able to actually rise and overcome? Ultimately, Martin Van Buren, with some help from other people, notably the actual Sylvesters themselves, and whatever money he had, Martin Van Buren went shopping. And the very next day, he came wearing some of the most high-class outfits you can think of to the clerk's office, and immediately was stunned a bunch of different people. He's like, all right, respect. You got that drip, homie. He's looking good. Martin Van Buren would wear clothes like that for the rest of his life. Which is funny, because you don't think clothes having that big of an influence on people. But even back then, and especially back then, it's a big difference. And that particular moment, I think, was one of the very few and many moments that doesn't get talked about in Martin Van Buren's life as a moment that really changed who Martin Van Buren ultimately would be. Breaking away from the ties and actually becoming his own man. Martin Van Buren is this country's 8th president of the United States of America. And a very, very, very interesting president that I don't know how I really feel about him. And I've said this of a bunch of different presidents for the most part. And it's really hard to, just characterize specific presidents into specific things. Like, some are very clear that I have very clear feelings about, that are very strongly negative or strongly positive. Like, no matter how hard I try, I don't think I'm ever going to truly like Jefferson, although I understand him. And it's going to be hard to take Washington, make me say anything negative about Washington. Martin Van Buren is a very fascinating politician, just in general, both for who he is, how he legislated, how he went about politics. He was a real fucking game changer, and also specifically for the way he influenced the actual political machines of basically America during his particular point in time in this country's history. And for him, you want to talk about some of those prominent figures, like the era between founding fathers and the Civil War. That's like 6 different people, and Martin Van Buren is one of those 6 different people. The others probably like Calhoun, Clay, Andrew Jackson, et cetera, specifically. And Martin Van Buren is one that influences politics in a way that once you really look at all the things that Martin Van Buren has his fingers in, that he's influencing, that he's pushing, the direction in which the actual country's gonna go, it's fucking insane how much influence he actually has in shaping politics. It's like, little things that he does ultimately end up shaping, I think, at least 1 or 2 different presidential elections in some way, shape, and form. Martin Van Buren is what I would consider like the genuine game-changing politician. He's probably one of the first genuinely modern politicians, I would probably say. It's him and like Henry Clay, I would say, are the 2 most prominent and specific modern interpretations of what I think politics are. I think in the modern age, and at the very least, like the biggest influences in how politics will be run and how politics will basically go into that, into that direction of partisanship. And not to mention too, he's deeply intelligent, fascinating. Just his brain and just a lot of his political ideas and theories, I think, are interesting, really, to say the least. I mean, he is basically the intellectual mind that would effectively created the Democratic Party itself. I mean, Andrew Jackson's the head of it, but the man behind the brains, the man behind all the plans, the man behind the influence that would create the Democratic Party that we know today, I would say goes with Martin Van Buren. Full stop. Martin Van Buren He's intelligent. He's strong. He's fascinating. And he's one that I think is this weird amalgamation of both politics and, I would say, relatively speaking, principality. You know, don't get me wrong. He would vote in favor and choose political sides for the most part, and choose a lot of things in his best behavior. But most of those things are always like, small little things that weren't going to really sway like legislation in a negative and positive or whatever way. But for the most part, he always voted his conscience and voted in the way that he was always going to vote for or rule and whatnot. Notably, Texas. I mean, he was not for annexing Texas, and that basically pissed off. That was a big reason why he ended up losing the actual Democratic Party nomination for the presidency in 1844. Or at the very least, that's what a lot of people say. It was a couple of other things, but for the most part, that was the nail in the coffin. Martin Van Buren is fascinating because I think if people wanted to make an argument for politicians and politics, etc., Martin Van Buren is the prime example of how it probably should be. I'm all over the place with a lot of these presidents, and Van Buren is really no different. But I tend to have much more of a genuine soft spot for Martin Van Buren than I think most other presidents I normally would have. By all accounts, he's not a bad man, and in fact, maybe it could be through political reasons, because it's complicated. Because I don't think he's a bad man, but is it because of politics? Is it because of maybe misrepresented media? Like, history for us, is basically just a compilation of other people's writings, what we're guessing about their particular time and era, for the most part, with human nature and logic, and other people's writings about other people. Like when people read about George Washington, they're reading the newspaper articles that were written about George Washington, from both political factions and whatnot, his own writings and his own writings to people and from people, etc., and just the correspondence he had with other people, Lafayette, like, point fundamentally being that I'm not saying we can't trust history, because I think history is truthfully, objectively, and fairly pretty accurate by all accounts and measurements. I just think today, modern age grossly misinterprets history in such a grossly subjective way, which is the reason why I'm doing this series. But my point is that, we really don't know these people. We just don't. We're taking the most incredibly educated and functionally researched guess that we can possibly take about every single one of these particular individuals and people. And it's tough for people that, for some people, because you question whether they do these things for good or for bad. And Martin Van Buren, in a lot of ways, I tend to question, because there's so many positive writings about him, but at the same time, he might have been one of the most incredible, shrewd politicians of his particular era. Henry Clay would clamor his butt cheeks just to shaking his pants if he had to go against Martin Van Buren. That being said, Martin Van Buren was also the product of I guess you could say the failures of the Jackson presidency, but I wouldn't even say the failures, the negative aspects of what effectively would be, I guess you could say, the downfall of the last couple years of the Jackson presidency, for the most part. And it's tough, because it just makes it tough to really assess Martin Van Buren, because he's just like Madison in a lot of ways, where it's really difficult to assess him when one specific thing really dominates your entire presidency, and it's really difficult to take away the good and the bad, or the entire thing of it, because for Martin Van Buren, it was the Panic of 1837, and once that panic hit, his presidency was doomed from the get-go. That being said, if Martin Van Buren was given, a crossroads moment, and people just said, fuck it, we'll give you another term, interesting, who knows? Things might be different. Anyways, I guess what I'm ultimately trying to say is Martin Van Buren is a fascinating president, and when I start this, entire series and in this entire episode, I think, my opinion will change probably a couple different times about Martin Van Buren. He's a roller coaster ride, and I hope you guys can really enjoy this roller coaster ride of sorts. So anyways, let's just get started. Martin Van Buren was born on December 5th, 1782. Little tidbit, he's the first president born after the Declaration of Independence. I just want to point that out too. And, he's born in the second generation, I guess you could say, of political leaders that would be between Washington and Lincoln. It's ironic because he's actually born the same year as Daniel Webster and Henry Clay. His family name is very fascinating. So before we get into the actual family itself, it's fascinating. First and foremost, Van Buren actually means, specifically definition-wise, from Buren, apparently. The family name, technically speaking, was Cornelis, I believe, or Cornelis Mason, son of Mace, examples and stuff like that. But the actual family name itself was Cornelis. And then once the family moved to New York and actually Manhattan Island, they would live near Albany, actually, or in Albany. They just effectively just changed it that way. And Van Buren ended up being the whole fucking name that he would end up keeping for the rest of his life. I just found that really interesting. Anyways, his father's name was Abraham. Abraham was a patriot. He would fight in the war for New York specifically, as an actual soldier within the actual army itself. And little tidbit too, his family is pure fucking Dutch. I mean, you want to talk about some fucking Holland boys? Like, this motherfucker was Dutch as fuck, okay? In fact, Martin's first language would be Dutch. He's the first and only president to have English as his second language. And his family, and his father and his family lived in the town of Kinderhook. And that was specifically a Dutch town. And it was isolated except for, the occasional visitor for the most part. Most people in that little Kinderhook town growing up after the war, I mean, most people, they just married Dutch for the most part. So, like, hey, Dutch lady, you're divorced, let's just get married for the most part. And, like, it was hella Dutch, okay? Hella Dutch. And I'm pretty sure Martin Van Buren's wife is Dutch, too. But I'm not there in my brain yet, unfortunately, because I'm in the childhood mind right now. But it's really, really, really fucking Dutch. And like I said before, other than the isolated visitor that would go by between like New York City and Albany, etc., it's, basically, for the most part, strictly Dutch. And a lot of people were kind of weirded out by this specific place, But, I mean, it was what it was, just how strictly Dutch they were. Anyways, his father was not a rich man, despite being actually a land-owning free man, I guess you could say, for the most part. I mean, he actually had slaves, like 5 or 6, but financially to support, the actual wife, his wife actually was married previously before. She had 3 kids before, and then they should have another 3 kids with Abraham. And it was really difficult financially to support all the kids, obviously, especially since, despite being a solid farmer, it was just not lucrative. So Abraham decides he's going to come up with this idea and open up a fucking tavern because, make some extra cash moolah. Not to mention, too, the family would live in the tavern as well, for the most part. So he made this tavern. Martin, again, like I said before, Martin and his siblings ranging from, at this point, 24 to 4. I think the third of 5 from his mother's from the actual second marriage. For the most part, he's technically like the middle child in the second. It's fucking wild, back then. I mean, babies been born fucking everywhere, and basically Martin and most of his family would either farm or they would go and specifically work in the tavern, pouring drinks for a whole bunch of different people. Where a couple things that would notably during this initial upbringing for Martin would be, the learning all the political talk and stuff. Because, I mean, a whole bunch of people would come, Democratic, Republicans, and mainly Federalists, because, New York is dominated by Federalists. Notably, he would actually get to serve drinks to, Alexander Hamilton, Aaron Burr, all those people who would come frequent on their trips back and forth between, DC and stuff, and just pass by the actual tavern itself. Again, it's not like it happened every single day, but you got to meet one of the best historical figures and one of the greatest historical figures of all time in Hamilton. Okay, he's my idol personally, but it is what it is. It was a bit of a hard life. So when I meant like rags to riches, it wasn't like they had everything. They were all living in the cramped tavern for the most part. People were working constantly, and Martin wouldn't have the greatest education growing up, at the very least, initially speaking. I'll get to that in just a second. Despite all this, Martin Van Buren loved his parents so much. He cared about his family so much, and despite all the struggles, honestly, Martin felt like he had a pretty solid life. He would feel insecure with other people, but he himself, I think, was emotionally content. I mean, he looked at his father. His father was a saint, calm, cool, polite, gentle, and tender. I think he described him, and a charitable man to the kindest degree that Martin really loved. And his mother. His mother was really kind of like George Washington's mother, very strong, very determined to raise Martin and his siblings with the correct virtues of valor and fidelity. And his family was just close throughout their entire lives, within reason. Many living into adulthood and being a part of other historical events as well, along like a lot of his family members would be. His older brother, also Abraham, would actually fight in the War of 1812, and his younger brother, Lawrence, actually being a pretty solid worker and caretaker of his estate for the most part in the near future. So Martin Van Buren's early childhood was him just growing up in this tavern, in this basically kind of, in many ways, political world. His family was never really rich, like I said before. They owned slaves, I think 5 or 6 when he was growing up, and they weren't poor like Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was basically scraping by, and whatever penny his mother had, she basically just spent on their schooling for the most part to better their children's lives. And Martin Van Buren and his family weren't like that, but again, this is much more of a rags to riches story than anything, the previous founding fathers had actually gone through. And it wasn't, but it was still a pretty blessed childhood with a brilliant family, really loving and caring father and mother. And, he grew up working like a lot of the people back then. And he went to school. There was only one school in Kinderhook. It was one classroom that he would go to until he was the age of 14. It's fascinating, actually, because by the time he's 14, he's actually educated more than most adults at that particular point in time. And like I said before, first language is technically Dutch, second language English, what I always find really interesting. But for the most part, he worked. He would basically work on the farm itself, doing whatever his father asked of him in the tavern, helping people to the rooms, clerking, cleaning, sweeping. If he wasn't doing that, he was out farming, maybe getting some of the vegetables ready to help feed the family or sell to the market. Sometimes in the winter, he would get a whole bunch of different vegetables and put them on a sled and just go to the market because work always had to be done. Martin Van Buren, during his upbringing and his childhood, learned 2 things. One, hard work and commitment to something. That if you're going to do something, you're going to do it, which is really valuable for a young man at that particular time. Then number 2, he learned the actual political machine at a very early age, because there's a whole bunch of people going in and out of his tavern that he was really exposed to in the entire politics and the political machine. And, I can get into a whole broader discussion for the most part because it's fascinating, because New York is a federalist state, and especially during the heyday that he grew up in, specifically with, Alexander Hamilton could not have been a much more popular politician, et cetera, et cetera. Adams is a Federalist. Washington is basically a Federalist. And, he and his family are Democratic Republicans. His father's a Democratic Republican and always espousing, Jeffersonian ideals, et cetera, and he would adopt a lot of those policies and principles. I think it's fascinating because I think a lot of presidents and politicians end up adopting a lot of the politics of their parents for the most part. Like more often than not, I look at a Democratic president, for instance, or a Democratic politician, especially in the 20th century too. I'm just like, I'm probably gonna guess 9 out of 10 times their parents were probably Democrats or Republicans specifically, and for the most part, it's pretty true. The few outliers specifically, are always the ones that are shocking. Like Reagan, for instance, is an example of the opposite of that for the most part. His childhood, at least in his interpretation, was very blessed, but full of insecurities too, because, you see a lot of these politicians wearing suits, etc., looking nice and exuding wealth in many aspects, in many ways. And again, a lot of people have to understand the politics at that particular time, even for, people of his age, were very, understanding of the reality that if you're into politics, you were a free man, etc., and it was a way for power, influence, and, it's very true even in Kinderhook with the Dutch. Which little tidbit, there's a bunch of stories of Martin Van Buren being able to speak to the Dutch Queen at one point in his life, and I think it's really interesting. He grew up. They called him Matty, or Matt, or instead of Martin. And his nickname, just a little tidbit too, would actually be Old Kinderhook. He would actually popular the actual term okay itself, like the actual okay term, because of his 1840 election, basically being the OK Club for Old Kinderhook. I thought that was a really fascinating little tidbit. So if you want to say everything's A-OK, you can think Martin Van Old Kinderhook, So like I said before, Martin's a young lad. He's growing up, and he's in the tavern and whatnot. And I think it's really interesting to get a really good gauge on, like, politics, not in the actual political sphere that we read in history books, but for Martin Van Buren to actually see it in a tavern with just random, political figures, I guess you could say, really influencing people and having a, sway in how things are going to be run in the political sphere machine. And Martin gets to see all this. He gets to see the underground routes, the backdoor deals, and I think that's really interesting. And for him, a lot of things really start to become clear when you really research them. Like New York may have been a very Federalist dominated state, but it's also understandable why, despite his family relations, etc., the lineage, whatever you want to say, but it's very understandable for the Democratic Republican Party kind of rising a little bit in that state too, because you understand, like Virginia and every other state, there's a bit of a hierarchy, a social hierarchy, that goes along with status, I guess one would probably say. And it's unfortunate because his father was a very prominent person, Abraham, within Kinderhook itself, and a really good person, helping whenever he could. But at the same time, he was a farmer and a tavern owner. He wasn't, the president or any significant lawyer or prominent individual that was going to influence the political game in any way, shape, or form. And a lot of those things really hurt Martin. If he felt insecure, both for him and his father and his family, that they were, not high class in any way, shape, or form. Sometimes being insecure about the clothes that he wore, some of the way he spoke. He was insecure about a lot of things, and he was the kind of person that wanted to change it if he possibly could, and he would actually, which is what he would eventually end up doing. He would have some speech problems because Dutch was his first language, and the way he wrote was specifically fascinating to read some of his writings. But he worked on it, and he actually became probably one of the most proficient writers of his generation when you read some of his work. It's little things like that that really shape the personality and the capabilities of what a human being in person can do. And Martin Van Buren was someone that looked at life in that particular way. He would never truly overcome his insecurities, but he would really lessen it down to a point where he would basically be a strong, functional person within everyday society. And I think that's just really interesting. But it sucks because that would influence the way he saw things, because he didn't want him to be stuck in a particular caste system of sorts where he's always going to be second fiddle. He didn't want to be a farmer and didn't want to be any of this. I think he was capable and content with it, but if he can get an education and move on and do something with his life, he would want to do it. He wanted to break the whole European idea of hierarchical societies, and was just someone who really was a really positive person in a lot of ways. I mean, a lot of people around that time would always say, you know what, I like this young Martin Van Buren. He's really interesting to talk to. He's always optimistic, and his family and parents were always very optimistic too, and I think that helped, despite, some troubling situations, like for him, especially being in a tavern, et cetera, there's no privacy, so for him, a lot of the things that would actually help him be a politician were just his upbringing, I would probably say, like learning to adjust to others and to others' needs, learning manipulation techniques of people with different strangers, like I said, and a lot of family members, And above all else, I would probably say the biggest thing, especially with his family, which is why their family was always so strong for the most part, was compromise. Okay, they would always compromise on things, big, small, etc., etc. They would go to sleep knowing that, okay, we're good. The whatever it is settled. And that was just really kind of the Van Buren way in a lot of ways. So when it comes to his education too, by normal 14-year-old standards who are in the political game or of higher class, he's pretty well educated. But by the political class, the Jefferson class, Washington class, etc., he's poorly educated by their standards, and he received basic arithmetic, some Latin, and just the normal basic bare bones stuff. And it became a problem for some time until he actually really worked on it, with some of his writing, his vernacular. His writing in particular would actually be would allow his political rivals to take advantage, because they would basically say, what a fucking idiot, huh? And Martin's like, dude, I'm fucking trying to read and write in Dutch and English, like, work with me, fam, okay? But for the most part, he actually was able to really work on it. He pushed himself, like I said before, and whenever he got an opportunity, he would always read a lot of books too. Love to read. Everyone loves to read. I mean, there's nothing else to do back then, obviously, but to read books, and every single book that he can get on, because they're not the richest family. But maybe the Bible, etc., little things around that particular point in time. So Martin grows up. He's a young adult at this particular point in time. His childhood goes by pretty quickly. It's pretty standard, if I'm going to be completely honest, because with Andrew Jackson, there was a whole bunch of things that came about with his childhood. But he grew up. He grew up and lived specifically his entire young adult life in, I would say, the constitutional era of the United States, with the creation of the Constitution to basically the end of Washington's presidency is when he gets the real first opportunity of his life and career. So a lot of his family were really trying to figure out what to do with Martin and what, because his family, his father, while not the most prominent individual and figure, he could pull some strings and he could be like, hey, can you get my son to do this, and he was a good man and he could pull a lot of favors, and he was able to get a lot of his son's real opportunities to do a whole bunch of different things, and for Martin, he basically asked him, hey, do you want to go to New York City? And Martin really wanted to go to New York City, but he also felt really insecure about going to New York City because it's fucking New York City and he'd be away from family. And it's a fascinating opportunity because he'd be able to go to clerk and really study law, and really become really aggressively educated and read and be able to do a lot of the things that he wanted to do, and his father really pushed him to do it and really supported him in a whole bunch of different ways, and his mother's really apprehensive about it, but he's just like, hey, this is a Gucci opportunity, and this is gonna be best for the family for the most part too, so I just hope Martin can choose the right path and do the right thing. And Martin's like, all right, father, I'll do it. So 13, 14 years old, Martin Van Buren, around the end of Washington's presidency, decides he's going to uproot his entire life and move to New York City. Okay? And there, while in New York City, he'd be working for a couple law firms. During this particular point in time, the Sylvesters or whatever you want to call them, the Sylvesters. I don't know how you fucking pronounce the name, but he basically be working for the most part at because he never went to college. You have to understand that. And I think he was the only person that didn't go to college. But then again, you didn't really need to go to college. And it was specifically, he was just going to be working as a lawyer. So his father called him that political favor, and he worked at a lawyer's office as a law clerk, and he clerked for 7 years. The next 7 years is what he would be doing. He'd be sweeping floors, running errands by day, studying law at night, and just continuing that time as New York City is growing in a population, size, everything that you can think of. And he loved it, hated it, and felt really insecure the entire time that he was there in the early goings of New York City, or at the very least for the most part. Despite, the conflicting reality of what New York was, Martin was, at the very least, fundamentally adapting. You have to. At this point, New York is growing. The Industrial Revolution's really coming to New York City. There's a bunch of people moving to the city itself. Population going from 65,000 to 70,000. It's growing completely. Everyone's coming to New York City, and Martin's really a very curious and very knowledgeable and very aware person of his surroundings. He's growing up to his young adulthood around this particular point in time, and he's studying law. He's focusing, and the story that I had talked about earlier about Martin Van Buren studying law, and the clothing, it would occur around this particular point in time. Many of the actual law offices he would be working at, the Sylvesters, whatever you want to call them, were the ones that really were kind of, I don't even want to say molding him. A lot of the actual Democratic, Republican lawyers and politicians, they were kind of there around that particular point in time. His father had some fucking hella connections, if I'm gonna be honest with you, because Martin was immediately, introduced in a lot of ways to some aspects of the actual political game, very early on during his time in the early goings of New York City, which is gonna be fascinating for a young, pretty good looking, 5'6" kind of Martin Van Buren, who's really just trying to just focus and actually get the English language down fully, fundamentally, to a point where it doesn't sound like he has an accent. But over time, it became very clear to a lot of people that it was going to be trial and error for Martin Van Buren. Not because he wasn't intelligent by any stretch of the imagination. He was actually quite smart, and pretty smart for his age, and capable of really learning and excelling in his education and really picking up law. But a lot of them were very politically motivated, I guess you could say, if that makes any sense. Because you have to understand, like I said, it was basically Sylvesters and I'm getting my shit confused. Federalists, and then the Democratic Republicans, who, like the Sylvesters, who were, I guess you could say, Martin's lawyer or law, I guess, surrogate father. I don't know what you want to call them. They were the ones that really introduced him to the initial goings of how politics worked, how law worked, how everything kind of worked and functioned for the most part. It wasn't until he got the opportunity to spend the final year of his apprenticeship. He's around 19, 20 years old. Young Martin Van Buren meeting and being able to work for William Van Ness. William Van Ness was one of the political advisors of Aaron Burr in New York City. And understand, this is before Aaron Burr becomes an absolute fucking, hateful person. He's actually vice president at this particular point in time, and he sees everything around this particular era. He introduces them to everything, the specifics of New York state politics, and Martin Van Buren gets a front row seat to, for the most part, see the battles between men like Robert Livingston, George Clinton, Burr, all for the actual Democratic Republican Party can basically control the state for the most part, or at least that section of the party's state control. Because at that point, the Federalists, were kind of slowly dying down around 1803, 1804, and New York had a real opportunity to go, to the Democratic Republicans, and it's in a lot of ways, like one of the first real swing states when it came to an election around that particular point in time. It can go either way. Ultimately, really wouldn't make that much of a fundamental difference, since most states were probably going to vote one particular side. Obviously, there's only one Federalist president, technically. So skid off my shoe. But anyways, it's just around this particular time, Martin Van Buren's seeing and really liking politics and really enjoying the political machine. First time that he truly felt, like he really belonged in a lot of ways. And this is around this particular time that, he starts seeing it. He really learns how to talk like a lawyer, too. He's really getting this fucking game down immediately. He's a very quick learner. And he begins, having several ties to politicians, that would, like, that with, along with, that for Buren, Martin Van Buren would meet and make good connections. Aaron Burr, actually kind of saw him and was like, yeah, he's interesting. He's a good, handsome young man, like he's building connections. He's building all these little ties that would eventually help him rise in actual New York State politics for years to come. New York was very fascinating to young Martin Van Buren, full of wiles, wonders, for a young adult to really get to enjoy himself. And yet, everything kind of has to come to an end, at the very least, in the meantime. Once, he's enjoying all the, political stuff and the actual political fervor, politics in general can be something that's very addicting. And for Martin Van Buren, he got a couple sniffs in, if that makes any sense. Politics being the equivalent of cocaine. Martin Van Buren seeing that he really needed to support himself, big money, because he'd be working at this clerk office, and he really wanted to start his life. And after 7 years and feeling truly 100% fully sufficient, both in over his overall education and also just with the law itself, Martin Van Buren takes the New York State bar and passing it in the year 1803, well into the beginning of the Jefferson presidency. And that's the particular time, too. The economy's doing pretty good. Life's doing pretty good. And Martin Van Buren sees a real opportunity. So he decides he's going to go back home. So he goes back home to Kinderhook. In Kinderhook, he opens up a law firm, actually, with with one of his older half-brothers. What was his name? What was his name? It's going to really bother me. James Van Allen. Why can't I not think of people's names? He opens up an actual practice with his older half-brother, James Van Allen. And a lot of things happen. He gains a lot of money, a lot of reputation. Most of his cases, for the most part, are basically just like disputes between tenants and renters and contested landlord colonial-era claims, pre-actual United States Constitution and Declaration of Independence. A lot of on the Hudson Valley River. And basically, this did a couple things. One, it meant a big workload for Martin Van Buren, so he's making a shit ton of money. I mean, a shit ton of money. And you have to understand too, like when it comes to like incomes, a whole bunch of other people had different variations of income. Martin Van Buren's basically just like, I'm a lawyer, I'm content with it, that's it. He wasn't gonna get anything extra. If he got anything extra, it was always with maybe some political favors, but he detested bribes, in fairness. And a lot of his writings really showed that. Or at the very least, some of his writings showed that. He was a very politically active person, I will say that much. I'm getting way ahead of myself. Martin Van Buren, around this particular time, got a lot of working with a whole bunch of tenant farmers and their accusations, etc., etc. And he was working non-stop, it felt like, along with this older half-brother. And, he's going out every day to do a whole bunch of different cases, and he's making a lot of money and gaining a reputation. And that reputation is something that's going to help the Democratic Republicans, which is fighting for the common man, fighting for the common person, When you side with the common people instead of the landlord elites, I guess you could say, Van Buren kind of just becomes a bit of a very fascinating hero in Kinderhook and a lot of the other, places around New York specifically, And it's one of these things that's helping to ferment what I would say, social and economic relations within the early American Republic between, the rich and the poor, Like white suffrage isn't a thing yet, but it will be a thing. And it's people like Martin Van Buren that really push for it. They really push for, eventually at a specific time that the state legislature won't, vote for the electors, but the people will vote directly for the electors. It's still things like that Martin Van Buren will help promote and emphasize, I guess you could say, in a lot of ways for the most part. Note too that he was also an absolutely rising star in New York politics, both along with his, credentials from before, again, making a whole bunch of different connections. And now, on top of that, he's got this reputation for a man of the people lawyer, This guy's something else, Mr. Martin Van Buren. Very fascinating Mr. Old Kinderhook. So before we continue with his life for the most part, I think we should fundamentally, God, I say fundamentally a lot, explain the political scene both in New York and I think just in the entirety of the country itself, because when Jefferson gets elected, the country changes in a lot of ways. It goes from this Federalist society, for the most part, Federalist-dominated Congress, to the Democratic Republicans. And it's a bit of a culture shift, too, because, for better or worse, the Democratic Republicans really took control and really started representing the people of America, and specifically the poor people of the United States of America, I guess you could say, for the most part, because the Federalists were, because most people in America were pretty well off, at least in terms of just wealth for the most part, and the Democratic Republicans, and for the most part, the poor people were not fundamentally represented, and the Democratic Republicans really, took them, and a lot of people really liked that, and the Democratic Republicans specifically were the ones to really kind of like attempt to be the middle guy. They represented both the rich and the poor, et cetera, et cetera. And, it should just be noted that their popularity was growing. They really expanded their base for the most part because, for everything that the Federalists represented, the party of Hamilton and all that, their intelligence, brilliance, et cetera, they weren't smart in the sense of political savvy and communicating and representing people for the most part. They basically were just representative of just northern industry and really not much else, unfortunately. There's a lot of reasons for that. It was mainly due to the reality that the party was split, and it sucks. And then Hamilton dies, and then Adams kind of just retires from politics, and it's really just a shit show free for all for the most part, with a whole bunch of different people trying to steer the party in their particular direction. And the same thing would kind of happen with the Democratic Republicans too, especially when Jefferson leaves. But the problem is that, at least for the Federalists, is the fact that, there's a succession plan. There's Madison, there's Monroe, there's Quincy Adams, for better or worse, and there's different sections that are kind of vying for power that are growing with basically in every single state, for the most part, in the direction that they will take their respective sect of the party towards, for the most part, I guess what I'm trying to say is the Federalists, with no leader, no goal, no succession plan, they weren't forward-thinking in terms of the party's future itself. They were forward-thinking in the direction the country itself should go. But unfortunately, and it's kind of vice versa, ironically, with the Democratic Republicans. Because the Democratic Republicans, Thomas Jefferson's fever dream is an ultimate agrarian society of liberal, liberty-minded individuals and people. Obviously that's not going to work out. It's just a genuine truth that they were just a much more organized party based off of the bare bones fundamental that they were going to, first recruit the poor people, and then for better, and it was also around that time too that they really started changing a lot of voting laws too, in New York in particular, with the help of Mr. Martin Van Buren himself. And, it's a bit of a shift. And then the Democratic Republicans really, won in, I guess you could say, those certain aspects. And they really took advantage of the actual political opportunities that came of it for the most part. And ultimately, that's the biggest reason why I think the Federalists died out. It wasn't the fact that, they died or didn't have any direction in the party. The biggest problem is that there's more people that ended up being able to vote for the most part, and the Federalists basically just couldn't expand their base. You can only have so many rich people and aristocratic individuals before, well, next thing you know, your party is being coalesced into the actual Democratic Republican Party. Anyways, that's just a bare bones idea of where the party is and where the country's at in the very early 1800s, and especially when Jefferson gets elected. Because you have to understand, when Jefferson gets elected, for Martin Van Buren, that's like a fucking fever dream. He actually would get to meet him, and actually get to communicate and talk with him. I think at one point, it was the biggest reason he was meeting with him was to get the endorsement from Jefferson for Andrew Jackson as president. But Jefferson wasn't the biggest fan of Jackson for numerous reasons, because he's Jefferson. At the same time, Martin Van Buren, if you want to know what Martin Van Buren thought of America and how people should be, it's a mixture. Martin Van Buren is weird politically, and I'll get to that when he actually becomes president, for the most part. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that he is a Democratic Republican states' rights person at heart, but he's a much more complicated political figure, and he will be throughout his entire life. And I'll probably explain more of that when we actually go through, for the most part, the entirety of his life. So when it comes to New York State politics, and again, this is just going to be the bare bones, fundamental understanding. If you want to know why New York is such a big, prominent state, especially now, I would argue, at least in terms of political capabilities, it really starts with like the early 1800s, and in a sense, like Martin Van Buren, whether it's his like Albany Regency, the Tammany Halls, like at one point, if you were governor of New York, you were like an actual genuine presidential candidate, and it's quite fascinating. And Martin Van Buren, 1802, 1803, Jefferson's president, and the Jeffersonian people, they're gaining steam in every single state for the most part. And Martin Van Buren eventually will lead his sect of the Democratic Republican Party within the actual state of New York itself, which, in fairness, is a big task, because New York is hardcore Federalist. It's still the party of Alexander Hamilton, and Hamilton's a New Yorker. You know what I'm saying? New Yorker all the way through and through, and it's beyond Federalist. But there's problems though. Hamilton's not as politically in the actual political game itself. He's focusing on making cheddar, because he's a fucking capitalist. He's the father of capitalism in many aspects, many ways. And other than the occasional him trying to stop Aaron Burr, which will eventually cost him his life, he's not really a politically motivated person. There's a whole bunch of different reasons that go along with it for Hamilton. A lot of it has to do with the fact that his reputation's a little bit complicated, and the party itself really is kind of directionless. And despite it being this stronghold in New York, there are noticeable chinks in the armor. Like there's some, like if you had to draw like the actual districts, it's very slow but very sure. Some of these districts are trying to go, a little bit Jefferson, a little bit of Democratic, Republican, and it's deeply fascinating when I look at it in that particular way. And Martin Van Buren couldn't be happier, because he's steadfast in the actual principled belief of the Democratic Republican Party, and he sees it happening, and you have to understand what Martin Van Buren is, and I'll explain his political ideologies, et cetera, in the future, especially when he becomes president. If you want to know how Martin Van Buren is, he's the most, and it sounds bad, but like the most milquetoast fence sitter you will ever come across. He made it a point never to put himself in a politically, like he's never gonna stick his his flag in any particular issue for the most part. He's always going to be, I don't even want to say objective, but I would probably say much more. He's going to be very unbiased. He's just not going to choose a side, and he will never choose a side, and for a lot of reasons. First and foremost, the one instance that I'm going to explain in just a minute that he chose a side, it hurt him a little bit politically and professionally and emotionally doing so. So it's a big reason why he's, not a big, side chooser. The second, too, was it's politics, Martin Van Buren understood very early on, especially New York politics. Imagine seeing politics go 7 years, and you come to realization that, like, people making choices, people doing these things for other people, it's not very constructive for them, at the very least in terms of their future and their future political careers, because eventually things come to bite you in the ass, people come calling. And Martin Van Buren knew that better than I think anyone, especially in New York. He knew that better than anyone. So just keep all all the politics in mind for the most part. Let's get back to Martin. A couple things happen when he starts his career and his lawyer, because it's really good. He's making a lot of money. Two things really happen around this particular point in time, 1803 to 18, let's say 05, 06, around that particular era. Martin gets married eventually, or he reconnects with this lady named Hannah Hose. Hannah Hose. Sorry, I'm immature. Hannah would eventually be his wife. Also his first cousin. I don't want to get off topic, but, if people want to know about incest, come on. Like, it's everywhere. Not just Alabama, okay? Okay, now that sounds pretty fucking horrible, what I'm saying right now, but I just find it really fascinating and interesting. I'm just going to go into this right now, just to get it out of the way, because it's unfortunate, but, his family life is really fascinating, interesting, and kind of all over the place. But I'm just going to go through it now, because if I just go through it now, it's just going to be probably just a couple minutes. Hannah Hills was his first cousin, and they grew up together in Old Kinderhook. Like I said before, with the parents, the Dutch just really married each other. Regardless, they just did. Despite being the first cousin, they grew up together. They felt a shared camaraderie with one another, and although obviously it's pretty fucking weird, they're really close. And sometimes after he comes back from the big blue, the big New York City and all that stuff, they bond yet again, and I guess as he starts courting her, and next thing you know, they get married in 1807. And I must say, their relationship is fascinating because we don't know all that much about the relationship. I just want to point out, and I think this is the most fascinating aspect that people should think about. Martin Van Buren wrote an autobiography about his life, and not once in that autobiography does he mention his own wife, Hannah Hose. Now, some people might think the relationship was terrible or something like that, or, they might underthink, overthink, doesn't matter. The truth is that based off of some writings, I guess you could say, some letters from some early, before obviously Martin Van Buren's autobiography, it's pretty clear that the relationship was okay. It was good. It was loving and very caring for one another for the most part. I mean, they had 5 or 6 kids. The numbers go back and forth. 4 survived until adulthood, so I will go with that. And I'm pretty sure it's 5, but I'm not 100% positive. I think some of the older books that I read tend to say 6, but I think that might just be like a misprint or something like that. Anyways, he's 5, 6 kids, and a lot of things happen during his relationship with his wife and his kids. First and foremost, his wife is not the healthiest person. And in fairness, a lot of people were not very healthy people back then, but especially when you're churning out kids left and right. And from like 1807 until she died, she'd have 6 kids, and she'd be the primary person to raise them, and his kids struggled with his father always being away, because while he did pay for a lot of their education, all of their needs, obviously, he's out doing the political game and, doing his lawyer stuff. You have to understand, too, like, it's not. I'm not saying that all these politicians are terrible fathers, but you have to understand around that time, like, they're often away a lot, and the child ring ended up going to the mothers for the most part, and they would the children would always have difficult relationships with their parents, especially the ones who were in the actual political machine, the political game. Like I think John Adams, had he focused more on his family, he would raise 3 awesome kids, but or like however many kids he had, I think 4 or 5. Not all of them were great. It was only just John Quincy Adams, and that was just because John Quincy Adams was kind of a weird, amalgamation and weird outlier to the reality of family. And, Martin Van Buren was no really different, I would say, to any of the actual political figures of that particular time and era. That being said, it's not like he was probably there more often than most of the fathers. And especially after 1819, when Hannah Host dies. I'll get to the kids in a second. The reason why I think in the autobiography she's not mentioned in the autobiography by Martin Van Buren is for 2 reasons. One, the relationship's pretty short, and number 2, or pretty short, I would probably say, and I think he wanted to focus more on his politics. And I think if you write an autobiography about your political life, I would probably say, and especially for Martin Van Buren, it was much more so to, give his side of the actual political story for the most part, and empathize with his upbringing, etc., etc. Number 2, I'd probably say it was pretty traumatic for the most part. First off, like, they're close, I mean, from like day one, for better or worse, they were like Gucci with each other, and it must have been difficult because she had TB when she died, and if you don't know, TB is known as the wasting away disease, so she's literally dying in front of him and wasting away in front of him. And not to mention too, he would lose one of his sons, who he named after the General Winfield Scott, and he died in 1814, very, very young, very early. When she dies, I think it's one of those things that really changes you. And death affects everyone differently, and life affects everyone differently. And I think Martin Van Buren changes because, after this, he really focuses on the kids and his politics for the most part. But for a lot of reasons. I'll put it to you this way: like, as his kids got older, his dad is around more. The kids go and visit him more often. They're much closer as a family unit together. Especially his son Abraham is very close with him. So close, in fact, that Abraham's wife ends up becoming the White House hostess, I guess you could say, the honorary first lady during Martin Van Buren's presidency itself. And I guess you could say it's tragic in a lot of ways. But that's just my 2 cents. I just think death has a various different reactions to a whole bunch of different people. Because Martin Van Buren would never remarry, and there's no indication that he was ever going to court anyone either. So at least to me, that just shows there was no one else. It was always just her. And if I'm going to be 100% honest, that also shows just how, like, if you think people are principled or whatnot, etc., etc., I always look at the individuals, once love enters and exits their life. And when I look at Martin Van Buren never remarrying, I'm kind of just like, you know what? You're more likely a man of your word than anything else. And, I tend to look more positively at Martin Van Buren, at least in that more principled ideal and aspect for the most part. I would say the second most notable thing was, in a lot of ways, his political future. New York politics, at least for the Democratic Republican Party for the most part, is growing. And a lot of people kind of see this, and it's kind of like a weird power grab a little bit, because there's the old school, Democratic Republicans that are still there, like Aaron Burr, for instance, and then there's the rising stars like DeWitt Clinton, etc., who I believe he would eventually be a presidential candidate in the future. And the Democratic Republican Party in New York is really kind of splintered in a lot of ways. It's two camps. It's the old school versus the new school. It's fascinating. People need to look at politics and history, because there's so many parallels to what's happening today, happening yesterday. History always repeats itself, just in different ways and amalgamations, and it's just fascinating. And Martin Van Buren is at this particular point in time a relatively popular individual with political leanings. He knows a whole bunch of different people, and he's built himself up to be a really prominent, principled, and someone who doesn't choose sides. Like I said before, not necessarily objective, but he's a little bit like Washington, where he's just like, oh, I'm just gonna keep things close to the vest and not do anything that's gonna necessarily make me sway one particular way or one particular side. And for Martin Van Buren, in a lot of ways, he's kind of making a choice in some way, shape, and form, if that makes any sense, because they're kind of pushing him a little bit. The governorship's coming up, et cetera, and obviously Aaron Burr would eventually effectively lose it, because he's going to kill Hamilton. But at least for Martin Van Buren, his technical political sway actually might go a long way in deciding the future of the actual political machine in the actual Democratic Republican Party. It's kind of I'll put it to you this way: it's kind of like people who are kind of choosing, say, the Republicans in the late 70s. Are you gonna choose Bush, the older guy, or are you gonna choose Reagan, this upstart guy? And Martin Van Buren's kind of just like, you know what, I'd probably choose Reagan. He seems like he's gonna be the future of the party, for the most part, and ultimately that's what he would eventually effectively end up doing, and really side with DeWitt Clinton in most political matters, despite it kind of making him sick in a lot of ways. It's not that they didn't like each other. It was more so Martin Van Buren was a very opportunistic individual, and he saw that as a particular way for him to rise in the actual political machine. And even though he actually ended up siding with DeWitt Clinton, it also kind of made him a bit of a laughingstock in the party. Not like a laughing stock, more kind of like, you're going to join us? You said you wouldn't, but you always come crawling back to us. That it was more along those philosophical, I guess you could say just emotional lines. But Martin Van Buren had a plan. He always has a plan. And I think that's what people need to understand about Martin Van Buren. He's always 10 steps ahead of people. It may take a while, but he'll get there. And that's what I think is really fascinating about Martin Van Buren. And him siding with Clinton was dubious in a lot of ways. First and foremost, a lot of people label him a traitor. It was devious, unprincipled, and two things were really the biggest problem. First and foremost was that basically his teacher for law, William Van Ness, that he really studied for, was a really close friend and advisor to Aaron Burr, and it felt like betrayal for the most part, and betrayal of one's political ideologies and intentions and whatnot. And it was just a bit of a betrayal, so it was really difficult. But he saw the writing on the wall, at least with Aaron Burr and his potential future. Whatever his Aaron Burr, the unfortunate historical person. I think history's been really unfortunate for Aaron Burr, but I'm getting way off topic here. It was a move that in the long run was really, really, really incredibly smart, but really, really rough, at least in the early goings in the short term, because a lot of people didn't like that, and Aaron Burr was running for governor, so a lot of people were kind of like, it's foolish to go against Burr. He's a Democratic Republican nominee, et cetera, et cetera. And then Van Ness actually becomes his second in the Aaron Burr, I guess you could say, duel with Hamilton, and things work out in very fascinating ways, and Van Ness effectively becomes an accessory to murder, and Martin actually would help him for the most part as a lawyer, and try and get him out of it with whatever power he had and was capable of. I just think it's funny that history works in fascinating ways. So ultimately, it worked out very well for Martin Van Buren, and And despite, at the very least, because DeWitt Clinton was the leader, he had all the power in state politics. And understand too that New York State politics and politics in general, unless you fought in like the whole Revolutionary War itself and stuff like that, it really was led by, I guess you could say, the more aristocratic crowd. And Martin Van Buren, he effectively is a farmer's lawyer, unfortunately. So he's gonna have some issues with class, etc., etc., and he's just a really influential person, but he's not anyone that's going to be a senator anytime soon or actually make the laws and legislation, but Martin was biding his time. He was very patient with what he wanted to do and the direction that he really wanted to influence it, because he knew he had a voice within the actual Democratic Republican Party, and he was really going to use it. So for the next couple years, he's basically just with DeWitt Clinton on his side. He and his wife ultimately would move the actual family into the small little Hudson. It's called, the actual town is called Hudson. It's about 10-15 miles away from Kinderhook itself. And for the most part, they would just live there. I think at least until 1812. But for the most part, that's where Martin Van Buren would effectively be for the next, decade of his life before he actually becomes a senator. So he's finally settled on the Hudson. Hannah's popping out babies around this particular point in time, and he's married first and foremost. Settles on the Hudson, and Hannah starts popping out babies. Sorry, let me get my timeline straight. Martin, for the next 5 years, is fascinating. He's working really hard as a lawyer with his connections with Tompkins and Clinton. He ends up effectively getting opportunity to do a lot of surrogate. I think it's probate court, technically, would be the correct term for today, specifically. And he's just doing his thing. He's basically leading. He's one of the leading lawyers at this particular point in time in New York and in the area of New York City, because you have to understand a lot of things are happening. New York is in the thick of the Industrial Revolution and the market revolution, and the economy is really flowing around that particular point in time, from like 1804 to basically 18, from that period and point in time. Other than the obvious economic ups and downs with the Embargo Act, etc., etc., things are looking up for Martin Van Buren, especially being a lawyer for like tenant farmers and stuff. He's doing pretty fucking well for himself. He's financially settled, and he's able to spend more time with the family whenever he could. And every single chance he got, though, he was always going to, influence his political career, unfortunately, partially to his detriment. His reputation would really go really up and down, I guess you could say, for the most part. A lot of people, it was complicated, because a lot of people did see him as this guy who was fighting for the common man, but there's Federalist newspapers, and they're basically painting him as this politically motivated individual, and for instance, there's one case that he took that he was on the side of the common man only to get back at specifically Robert Livingston's promenade group. It was one of those things where it's like, he did the right thing, but he only did the right thing because it was an opportunity and an opportunistic move for Martin Van Buren to rise above some political stuff. It's complicated, so it really just depends on your personal opinion. And I just think Martin was just doing the things that he wanted to do to rise up in the political machine, both for himself and his family. It is what it is. It's politics, and people did this shit all the time. So I'm not gonna be shocked by it, and your opinion, I guess, but that's just what it is. And despite this, the common man still liked him, and I'm talking about like when his reputation grew too, and Federalists started really keeping an eye on Martin, because they're kind of just like, who is Martin, and it was really, really fascinating, because the Federalists, despite the Democratic Republicans rising, saw the stronghold, but it was really, really weakening. And with him, Martin Van Buren being one of the top earners of the region, one of the best lawyers in the state, and effectively someone who cared about the man, the common man, and being this leading figure, he would use his influence to basically get more political power in a lot of ways, because eventually he grew so big that by 1812 there really was no other person who was going to run for the state senate. So Martin Van Buren ends up taking a chance. He sees the opportunity, and the Federals are kind of worried. They're like, fuck, if he wins the election, shit, he's going to fucking wreak havoc, isn't he? He's like, fuck yeah, he just is, you know? And Martin Van Buren runs for the state senate, seeing that chance, and bam, he wins it. In 1812, I should probably point that out. 1812, he wins it, which is a very fascinating year for America, for obvious reasons, if anyone knows American history. So Martin Van Buren gets elected to the New York State Senate in 1812. Let me just give you some more backstory for obvious reasons, because the War of 1812 is very fascinating and complicated. You know, the Federals are basically gone at this point, but they're kind of having a bit of a resurgence, and mainly because they have this really aggressive anti-war stance that they're going to push forward in the election of 1812 or 1813, whatever year specifically. But 1812, they're going to present their, Federalist candidate, and James Madison's going to go for his re-election campaign pro-war. And Martin's in a bit of immediately he comes back in, and Martin's in a bit of a pickle for many, many reasons. First and foremost, the actual presidential nominee that he's going against Madison is DeWitt Clinton. He's basically, I don't want to say he's defected, but coming to a bit of an understanding, politically speaking. He is a Democratic-Republican politician who is going to run for the Federalist Party. I don't know how that works, but it works. Anyways, Clinton saw this as the opportunity for numerous reasons. One, New York is on the rise. New York, understand, like I said, when you want to talk about the influence of politics for the next couple of years, they're say what you will about New York, but they're fucking go-getters, especially at this particular point in time. They want to overtake Virginia. Virginia, with their long-ass dynasty of fucking founding father presidents, they're getting sick and tired of that shit. So they're going to try and do everything that they possibly can. And DeWitt Clinton, as the Federalist nominee, is like kind of like the best of both worlds at the very least. Although the Federalists won't win, primarily due to the reality that the war is popular because people want to defend themselves, and this is the beginning of this American identity, So the election actually happens, and Martin wants to choose Madison. Let me make this very clear. He's very pro, the Jeffersonian ideals and whatnot, but if he doesn't choose Clinton, his politics and his entire career in New York is over, and effectively this is more about him just choosing New York over his own personal beliefs, which is a bit of a problem for me, but it's one that's understandable. So Martin Van Buren is the one that endorses, in the old Kinderhook community and the people that he represents, for effectively DeWitt Clinton for president instead. And then Clinton obviously loses, and he's kind of just like, oh, thank God. I was secretly hoping, James would actually pull one out, and, New York becomes basically Democratic-Republican from this point on. The Federalists effectively die out, and Martin Van Buren gets to keep his state senate seat, and he actually gets to fully focus on his career at this particular point in time, which I'm going to get to in just a second. Sorry, I just need to explain that because it's very, very clear when you look at his early political record. It was more so just him protecting a seat for the most part, and it's a little bit unfortunate, but you have to do what you have to do because it's politics, baby. So now with his political career really beginning for the most part, Martin Van Buren is going to be fucking tested as hell, okay? He's going to wish he didn't do this and would be yeeted away, A lot of things are happening. First and foremost, he wants to help participate with the actual war effort itself. So he actually ends up trying to bring up some militias. He's a big motherfucking supporter of Madison, and all the Jeffersonian people. I'm not gonna say if he could suck their dick, but he would probably give them a hand job, if that makes any sense. And especially during the war, he's very pro-war. He actually worked with he would go from all around New York and a whole bunch of different places and actually talk to state militias, be like, hey, what you guys need? I can try to help you because we need to defend this motherfucker, you know what I'm saying? And it was actually around this time he actually gets to befriend a young general in Winfield Scott, I want to point out. He'd be very prominent in the Mexican-American War, and very prominent, I would probably say, between like 1830 and 1845 in politics. I want to make that very clear. Very prominent figure. Actually names the one son that did not survive, unfortunately, after him. But it's also around this time too that politics is really changing in New York City, with the Democratic Republicans really, for the most part, getting a real stronghold in, the 1810s for the most part, like almost a borderline majority, I guess one could say. More factions ended up brewing for power over the actual Democratic Republican Party in New York. Everyone was fighting each other. It was uncontrolled, and it actually ended up making things weaker for the Democratic Republicans in New York, and actually made Martin fear for a second that the Federalists might come back, and it's very complicated. It was a very inopportune time for the Democratic Republican Party itself in New York to really be fighting each other, but it is what it is. So Martin, for the most part, does what Martin does. He's basically just going to be unbiased. I'm just going to be this, independent individual. I'm going to be friends with everybody, And, despite all the setbacks within the actual state itself, he's still a promising rising star within the political party, And, I guess one way to explain how he would handle, political disputes and whatnot would be, he's basically just like, you know what? Hey, I'm just going to do this. I'm going to do a quick response. Hey, nope, I'm not going to say anything like that. And I guess one would say Martin Van Buren was very charming in a lot of ways when it came to, a lot of those disputes. And because let me put it to you this way. When people would try to basically say, what is your stance on this? How do you feel about this person? How do you feel about that person? And I've said this before, he would just basically charm some people away with his weird accents and whatnot and be, no, I'm good. Hey, you have a fine coat today, little things like that, I would probably say is how Martin Van Buren would really go about diffusing situations, And that would actually really, really help him in his rise to the actual vice presidency and secretary of stateship, and trying to work things out with the cabinet, And don't get me wrong, I think he loves Jackson, but at the very same time, I think, he's an opportunistic individual, is, who Martin Van Buren ultimately is, honestly. Despite being, I guess you could say, objective and not trying to be opinionated in one way or shape or another, this made Martin Van Buren a rising star, like I said, and this made him the ire and, the target of DeWitt Clinton, who at this point in New York, he's still king of New York because he just ran for president, almost beat Madison, and he's basically leading New York. And these battles that they would have in terms of, I guess you could say the sections of political partisanship with Van Buren and Clinton would be very, very curious because, Martin's really trying to be objective. He's trying to be, I'm not choosing sides. And then Clinton, over the next couple years after the war after the start of the War of 1812, is really pushing for it. He's really pushing, And things really start getting heated near the war's end, around 1815 in particular. And it's very fascinating because, like I said, Martin Van Buren had really kept himself out of the whole partisanship because DeWitt Clinton during these whole factional battles are basically just like, yeah, guys, I just ran for president. I almost won, so you might as well just start sucking my cock. And everyone just started going towards DeWitt Clinton's section of the actual Democratic Republican Party. But at the same time, the only person that wouldn't is Martin Van Buren. He's the opposition to that in New York State itself. And fundamentally, Martin Van Buren, and I will say this is fascinating, he effectively created his own sect of the actual Democratic Republican Party, and with the purpose of trying to be principled, trying to be different, and trying to be, I guess you could say the diversity of ideas, and they called themselves the Bucktails, which I think is really interesting. They would wear these hats with the tails of deer that they would have hunted and distinguishing, I guess you could say, in New York, and it's really fascinating. And the Bucktails in particular were principled, and they weren't like, oh my god, this is insane, anything like, but they were principled because they always were founded upon, with Martin Van Buren in particular, on, I would say, 3 principles. First and foremost, they were committed to defeating the Federalists. They hated the Federalists. They hated the idea of what the Federalists were. Second, they saw, above all else, the Jeffersonian ideals and principles. You want to know about the Jeffersonian ideals and principles? Look at my episode 3. Yay. And at the very least, states' rights, for the most part, and the liberty of the man, the common man even, above all else. And third and foremost, that the Democratic Republican Party itself was always going to be in defense of the Jeffersonian principles in order to defeat the Federalists, And I guess you could say, fundamentally, that's just all what Martin Van Buren ultimately was around this particular point in time. In a lot of ways, he's a bit of a unionist, but, that's just my 2 cents on that particular little tidbit. Anyways, I'm getting way off topic here. It's these two. These two are fighting each other. A lot of people are kind of like, hey, these bucktails seem pretty cool. They're not like conniving political monsters like DeWitt Clinton is, or, scheming to try and take all the power that they possibly can get at this particular point in time. And let me make it clear, I'm not saying DeWitt Clinton's an evil person. I'm just saying that, the differences in politics between these two people and how they approached it were very fascinating and different. Clinton is much more just like straightforward, like, politician, and I'm going to get the upper edge because I'm going to choose the right things and whatnot. And Martin Van Buren's like, no, I'm not going to choose any opinion and rise in that particular way, shape, and form. Martin's rise within the actual political machine itself is both a brilliant one and, unfortunately, a bit of a devastating one for Martin. He would win his re-election bid, and I believe in 1815 or 1816 to the state senate, and also dually as the state's attorney general, which fascinating. I might want to add dually at the age of, I think, 32 around this particular point in time, and he had a lot of power and a lot of bucktails, a lot of his particular supporters for the most part, and a lot of his ideological pals and politicians were in the actual state government itself. The biggest problem, though, is that DeWitt Clinton, he's still too powerful, he's still too strong, and he's still way too fucking, brick shithousey for Martin Van Buren. And when DeWitt Clinton runs for governor in 1817, Martin Van Buren is just vehemently opposed to it. He's basically doing all he can to make sure he's choosing all the other people instead of DeWitt Clinton, but there's no stopping the machine. And DeWitt Clinton effectively becomes the governor of New York State itself. And immediately, DeWitt Clinton starts doing whatever he can to get rid of the bucktails that are in the actual state senate, etc., congressmen, etc. He's taking them all out for the most part. So Martin Van Buren's in the actual state senate, losing a lot of seats. He's losing a lot of people, losing a lot of support. And the next couple of years become really difficult for him in terms of trying to gain, political prowess. His reputation would be hurt a little bit by it, unfortunately. And on top of that, unfortunately, it's about 1819, his wife gets sick, and, she eventually dies from TB. So it's a really difficult time for Martin Van Buren. He's 35 years old. He's the head of his particular political sect of the Democratic Republican Party. Because you understand, the Federalists are gone at this point, and there's just a one-party system. So the different sects within the Democratic Republican Party are all fighting each other in various different states, and just different ideologies are trying to effectively come out in Monroe's presidency. And in New York, it's DeWitt Clinton versus Martin Van Buren, and their variations of the actual sects that they're trying to go with. I would say DeWitt Clinton's probably more of a Federalist-leaning kind of person, and Martin Van Buren is probably in the middle, I would probably say. He's not naive to government infrastructure, but at the same time, he's much more of a states' rights person and liberty-minded person, And it's funny, because he and Jackson, I think, would have very different ideologies, but they're also similar in the ways that matter. Like Union First, etc., etc. But it's difficult, he's basically become a single dad and is raising 4 kids, and his family would obviously help. But he made a lot of interesting choices. Like he wanted to really do better, so he would really focus on family for the most part, to a point where he actually became a really good father, and his kids would be his advisors while in the White House, for instance. And he really decides, okay, you know what, we're gonna fucking do this. I'm gonna take some cocaine, but we're gonna fucking just go for it, homie. We're gonna fucking go for it. And he just goes ape shit for like the next 3-4 years for the most part, And first and foremost, the main reason why is because he does what a politician and person should do. And that's, if you're going to legislate things that are going to help the state, okay? Because his reputation isn't dead or anything like that. He's still a good person, if politically biased at times. And Martin Van Buren basically made it a point, I'm going to just do the right thing, and we'll see what happens, and we'll just go from there. So he was more focused, he was more decisive, and he basically told whatever bucktails were left, hey, we're in this together, okay? We're going to do what's best for the states. We're going to go from there, and, whenever Clinton slips up, we'll be there. You know what I'm saying? But if Clinton does whatever he's going to do that's going to benefit the state, all for it. You know what I'm saying? And that actually kind of worked a little bit, and it was a different message from a lot of people. And he really, I'll put it to you this way, Clinton probably rubbed a lot of people negatively, unfortunately. And a lot of people ended up kind of leaving little by little to the actual bucktails themselves. And Martin Van Buren's little sect of New York State politics. And, it helped, too, that, like, there's actually some things that what Clinton was trying to do in terms of maybe some infrastructure, some rules and legislation that Martin Van Buren actually, like, was for and actually voted for. So, it kind of just showed, hey, he's not this politically biased person. He's going to do what's best, and the good-natured politicians, I guess you could say, of the Democratic Republican Party ended up going more towards the bucktails and siding with the bucktails and siding with Martin Van Buren in a lot of measures in actual state politics itself, A lot of people came. And above all else, he was able to get rid of a surprising amount of actual DeWitt Clinton supporters, a lot of it through like technical means, like, hey man, you didn't pay your taxes, so you really can't do this or do that, like little things, and we actually get them on the actual technical aspects. And obviously he could play it off as like, hey, I'm trying to make this shit efficient as possible, homie, you gotta deal with it. DeWitt Clinton was slowly going down. A little tidbit, and I would probably say this is a big start of it, Martin Van Buren gets so popular that by like 1820 he had effectively become the de facto powerhouse New York leader and representative. He had all the votes, and by all appearances, was working for the working man, and he had so many people that he could really effectively do whatever he wanted, and especially around this particular time too, voting restrictions are being relaxed. People are having much more of an instrumental voice. Martin Van Buren is quite possibly on top of the world at this particular point in New York State politics. Within 3 years, by 1820 to 1822, there is no one more popular, more powerful in New York State politics than Martin Van Buren. He becomes so powerful that he effectively has his own political machine known as the Albany Regency. I mean, it's so powerful that he can dictate politics that, I think Tammany Hall is starting at this particular point. He's telling Tammany Hall what the fuck to do. So there's that. Powerful Martin. Around this particular time, a lot of his perspectives start to change. Most notably, his idea of the one-party system. He sees that it's just not working. And let me make it very clear. I think a lot of it had to do with his own perspective. With imagine like, oh fuck, I basically rule New York right now, and that's kind of dangerous. He's very aware of his own power and his own capabilities. And he would always be a fundamental advocate of a two-party system, and it really starts around this particular point in time, and a lot of his writings, a lot of his sayings, and ideas, it's very fast. It's like a capitalistic approach, I guess you could say, his perspective of a two-party system, where it's like, if we have two parties, they're going to be basically fighting each other and working, towards basically giving us the best deal at the cheapest price. That's his perspective, and I fundamentally understand that, and his perspective on how he came about doing that and thinking about that. And New York is his. at this particular point in time, and he has so much fucking power and influence that two things happen. First off, he amends or is a part of the actual New York Constitutional Convention, really pushing for the white man's suffrage vote. So the more common man, that's just going to get him more power. Effectively, is what ultimately is going to happen. When that passes through in voting, and at this particular point too, in 1821, his power is secure. He's really trying to gain more control, more political influence in a lot of ways. Not like a money grabber kind of thing, but I think he's like, okay, now that I've got New York secure, let's see what's on the national stage, the federal stage, and he runs immediately for the federal congressional Senate seat of New York, and immediately wins it because he's the Godfather. He's Martin Van Buren. So Martin would arrive in Washington, quite possibly, and genuinely speaking, the most ready, most prepared, most juggernaut fucking individual to ever it. I don't even know how to explain it. I guess in a lot of ways I would probably be like, if fucking Bill Gates decided he wanted to run for a Senate seat, he'd be like, wait, what? That's strange, but okay. Like, not like in terms of just who the actual person is, but like in terms of the kind of the shock factor. It's like, wow, Martin Van Buren, like, fuck, he's a pretty well-known individual, and he's finally here in the actual federal political scene, and like he has a lot of sway already within federal, I guess you could say, jurisdiction. And it goes off. His first couple years are fascinating. He's obviously voting with the more Jeffersonian specific and Democratic specific people of the actual party. The way he goes about it, it's interesting because first and foremost, he's not a great orator for obvious reasons, with his dialect, etc. But he is one of the best debaters of his era. And he's actually so good at debating. He actually becomes the key figure whether certain legislation ends up passing or failing, and every single time he'd always vote, like I said, for the Jeffersonian ideals. He would always oppose federally financed internal improvements, tariffs, and although he was a Democratic Republican, he was one that would always read everything with a fine-tuned tooth comb. He was very fucking meticulous about it. Just this goes back to New York politics and just how he is. He's like, I'm not gonna actually vote for something or legislate something that I have no idea what the fuck it is. And like, I'm not gonna be made a fool again. The insecurities keep popping up, and he's just like, I will not be made a fool. I will not be made a fool, and that would actually fucking take him to the presidency eventually. Despite, his pushing for all the legislation, Democratic, Republican, Jeffersonian ideals, etc., the party's fractured. It truly is. The one-party system cannot function and survive, unfortunately. And the truth is that, everyone had different sections all across the country with their different perspectives and political ideologies. Like the Jeffersonian Democratic Republican South was going to be different than the actual Democratic Republican North. And there's a whole bunch of different people fighting for specific, I guess you could say, influence and territory. And the election of 1824 was one that was going to be very contested because it was very clear there's going to be a shit ton of nominees and people in their respective territories all fighting for one spot. And Martin Van Buren saw this initially as a bit of an opportunity for the most part, that I'm not saying he's going to see this happening, but I'm pretty sure he's very forward-thinking enough to be like, whatever happens during this election, there's potential for a second party to come up, because this 5 nominees cannot keep happening every single fucking year. Like, something's got to change, and it's just going to keep creating more divides. And if they could establish 2 parties, that'd be more opportune, but not like 15, and people were just voting in whoever at this particular point in time. And with the way our actual country works, you still need a majority to get something done. Otherwise, at this particular point in time, if we didn't, the election would just be like 1824, where Congress basically just chooses stuff for the most part. And that's kind of dangerous. So he's not naive to that reality. But he, at least in this election, he's going to try and see what's going to happen and play it out. So the election of 1824 comes in, and this is a very important election for a lot of things. First and foremost, he actually meets Jackson, and he's like, okay, I like Andrew Jackson. He's pretty cool, but in another era, another time, although Andrew Jackson is really prominent in this particular point era, I'm going to go with William Crawford, the actual former Secretary of the Treasury for James Monroe. Most of it with the reality of the consistent and basically really compatible ideology aligned with Martin, you know. Crawford's the old school Jeffersonian Republican, along with, he's basically just going to be more of a continuation of Monroe in a lot of ways for the most part. And he was actually a pretty big person back then too, so backing him and Martin backing him was actually really big. And big enough for him to get third place eventually, but I'm trying to say. So the three people were Andrew Jackson, the man of the people, you know, Henry Clay, Calhoun the South, and you know, then you got Quincy Adams for the North, and basically the Federalists, if I'm gonna be 100% honest with you. You know, and there's a whole bunch of different people that are all fighting for all the specific spots for the most part. And Crawford's this idea of old school Jefferson, but nobody likes old school Jefferson at this particular point. They want Andrew Jackson. And you know, the election occurs. Andrew Jackson gets first. John Quincy Adams second. Crawford gets third. Martin has enough influence, effectively, to really get a lot of pull. A lot of people to basically be like, hey, should probably vote in Crawford, you know. And New York goes Crawford, I believe. Unfortunately, for John Quincy Adams. And effectively, what ends up happening is that Crawford gets third place. And I guess what I'm trying to say is Martin Van Buren during this election has enough pull to get Crawford into third place. And if he gets into third place, then that means Crawford has an opportunity to actually still be president. If you're in the top three, you're in the game for the most part. You have the weakest chance, but you're in the game. And Martin probably thought he had enough pull, not enough swing, for the most part, in order to get Crawford elected. If not him, then at the very least Andrew Jackson. He did not like John Quincy Adams. Biggest problem is that Henry Clay has more influence, just enough influence to get, you know, several states onto the side of Andrew Jackson. And that starts getting I'll put it to you this way. That's not good. Martin Van Buren sees this and he's just like, oh, he sees this, and then when the news comes out, Jackson's mad. Obviously, he's like, "Oh, it's the car bargain" and stuff like that. And Martin Van Buren's like, because at this point Jackson's in the Senate, and he's just like, "Hey, Jackson, come over here." And he's like, what?" He's like, you see that shit?" He's like, "Yeah, I saw that shit." "Calhoun, you hear that?" "Yeah, I hear that." "They cheated. We should run again. I'm on your side." Sorry, that's a Sparks Notes version of effectively what happens, you know. And Martin Van Buren effectively ends up becoming one of the biggest aides to Andrew Jackson becoming president. And this is, I guess you could say, when Jackson, Calhoun, and all of them meet and really talk about what the actual plan is for the future. This is the beginning of the Democratic Party. You know what's funny, too? You can argue the Democratic Party was really because Henry Clay pulled a couple of strings to influence the election. Because there's this representative, Stephen Van Rensselaer. He voted in favor of Adams because basically Henry Clay is like, "Hey man, I'll give you this or you give me that." Because he was apparently he was going to vote for Jackson, and he's one of the big swing votes that effectively let New York go to John Quincy Adams. So you can just fucking blame Henry Clay in a lot of ways for the creation of this party. So anyways, everyone was disgusted by all the stuff that was happening. Everyone. I'm talking about everyone. Everyone that was basically in the South. Everyone that had voted for Jackson, Calhoun, even Crawford. They're kind of just like, what the hell? Like, why? You know, et cetera, et cetera. And everyone was just mad. And they all started giving their support to Jackson, specifically the big one, Van Buren, you know. And they start creating this plan, all three of them. They're because immediately Andrew Jackson ends up basically saying, I'm running for president in 1828, and Martin Van Buren's telling him all the things that, he should do and everything that Calhoun should do, he and Calhoun should do, because they're both senators, and they're basically just going to create this new party. They're going to coalesce all the people who are on their side, and they're going to separate from the Democratic Republican Party and basically just take the Democrat aspect of the Democratic Republican Party with them, and they end up becoming just Democrats, because it's one thing in this constitutional republic because it's fucking corrupt as shit, so the republic doesn't work, so we're gonna go democracy and Democrats, etc., etc. I mean, that's not obvious, but for the most part, in a lot of ways, I could argue that's kind of why they end up going with the actual Democrat title itself. He's always about a states' rights person, and I believe he understood the reality of the constitutional republic, etc., etc. But at the very least, democracy, equality for even the weaker men. This is what we mean. At least that's the intent, I would probably say. I'm probably wrong in that aspect, but Martin Van Buren effectively becomes the mastermind of the creation of the Democratic Party, the second party state, and the second political party within this country that would directly combat, I guess you could say at this point, the National Republicans, the old school Democratic Republicans, and really influence the downfall of John Quincy Adams and his overall presidency. In a lot of ways, the downfall of Henry Clay, although Henry Clay would really fight back in the next decade or so and really challenge the stronghold of the Democratic Party in the future. But, Martin Van Buren, effectively, in a lot of ways, I don't even want to say becomes like his campaign manager. He has his own campaign manager, but he's really pulling a lot of strings. He's doing a whole bunch of shit. I mean, he goes to visit Thomas Jefferson in order to, be like, hey, man, you want to side with us and shit like that? And Thomas Jefferson's like, I don't know. But it's he does he actually also visit John Adams, too, ironically, and also, it's like, why are you visiting my father, says John Quincy Adams. And he's like, I just want to meet him, maybe get some influence, and et cetera, et cetera. And he's basically the leading voice, for basically everything that would effectively happen. Leading voices in the opposition to Adams, undermine every single, politics, every single policy that he was trying to do. Notably, I might want to add, in order to achieve the ultimate, dagger and everything, put the knife in the back of John Quincy Adams, was being the leading figure in New York to lead the charge to approve the Tariff of Abominations, or the Tariff of 1828, which would also lead to the South Carolina incident, which ultimately chose to alienate the parties for the political gain for Jackson to win eventually. So it sounds bad, but in a lot of ways, Martin Van Buren is the reason why, I guess you could say, the catalyst for the Civil War starts. I mean, it's always going to start, but he is one of the big direct influences that swings New York for the Tariff of Abominations to actually occur. So anyways, John Quincy Adams, it's his downfall, and basically just the destruction of the Democratic Republican Party as it fundamentally splits. And you have this weird nationalistic Republican Party, but they're not really anything. They're kind of just the opposition party for the most part to what is now the Democrats. And Andrew Jackson is going to be the guy. He ends up winning the election of 1828, and I think it's just a good point now to really start and talk about Martin Van Buren's political ideologies. They're very fascinating, and he's very fluid too, because he kind of just goes all over the place ideologically speaking throughout his entire life. He's an ardent states' rights individual for the most part, for most of his life, and he still would be. But at the very same time, he was also a fundamental unionist, which, at the very least, were the two big things that really combined him with Andrew Jackson. Otherwise, he's vehemently opposite in a lot of ways of what Andrew Jackson was, almost to a point where, it's fascinating how these two even really got along in a lot of the ways that they did, but Martin Van Buren was capable of being a real crowd pleaser, a real people kind of person, and I think Andrew Jackson saw a lot of the similarities in their lives. Martin Van Buren was a widow effectively for most of his life, and Andrew Jackson was himself, and little things like that really come a long way to really build the bond and unity between the two most important members of the actual Democratic Party. Sorry, Calhoun. What there's no ideological spectrum, I think, fundamentally at this point, because it's all over the place. But if there is, he's probably center right specifically. If Jackson would be like a moderate right kind of person, he's basically center with a little bit on the right. But like, I guess you could say he's basically a liberal, except for the states' rights kind of issues. And in fact, he actually, I would probably say, goes more down that ideological spectrum when Texas and the whole issue comes up with Texas, because he opposes the annexation of Texas for a lot of reasons, both on just the fear reality of war and also for the potential expansion of slavery in the South and Texas, and he doesn't want that and vehemently opposes it. And if you want to consider John Quincy Adams like, I guess, the closest thing to a modern interpretation of a liberal, then Van Buren really goes down that path later in his life. But he's center right, I guess, is probably what I would say. But then again, it's really difficult to, put modern interpretations of what ideologies were when a lot of people really, like, the main fundamental difference was the powers of the federal government to the powers of the individual. But for the most part, everything else was pretty fluid for a lot of people, for the most part. And, it's difficult to assess that. That being said, at heart, he's always going to be a Jeffersonian Democratic Republican. I mean, so much more. It's fascinating, and I actually forgot to bring this up at one point. There's a whole bunch. I read this book, and it was this little tidbit about Aaron Burr actually being technically speaking, it was a bit of a scandalous thing that Aaron Burr was like Martin Van Buren's father for whatever, I don't know why. I think it's clearly a bit of propaganda kind of thing, but I thought that was really fascinating, and because a lot of people were kind of like, oh, he's clearly still with the Burr faction, etc., etc., because his entire life he was a part of the Aaron Burr faction, the Democratic Republican faction, when Jefferson leaves. For the most part, like, it's a little bit complicated and a little bit more complicated than that, but I mean, obviously it's kind of not true. It was more just because, like, Aaron Burr totally came in around that time and porked his mom, and it's highly unlikely. There's no similarities in their appearances, etc., etc. It's hard to explain, but I found that really fascinating because I just wanted to make the point, fundamentally, the specific degree that he cared about the Democratic Republican ideals, for the most part, which is why, like, when he was, for the most part, really siding with Clinton, he was basically going against his fundamental principles, and one of the things that, in a lot of ways, he would ultimately regret, at least emotionally to himself, for the most part. So once Jackson gets into office, everything's set. The Democrats really kind of run Congress, and Jackson's the most popular person on the face of the earth. And despite the political attacks that would kind of occur that would slow Jackson in his first term, I guess you could say, it's very clear. Everything's set up for Martin Van Buren, the states, right? Like, everything's set up for everything to go very, 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 very smoothly for them. And, around this particular time, Martin Van Buren, at the height of his powers, decides, you know what? I'm going to go for it. And remember this, too, because he's running for governor, is what I'm getting to the point, in the 1828 election. He's going to win, by the way, and it's kind of incredible that he's able to kind of finagle effectively more power into Andrew Jackson, for the most part, and effectively seal the chances of John Quincy Adams basically leaving the office now at this point in time. And it's just fascinating that he's able to do a lot of stuff while still raising 4 kids. I just want to point that out, at the very least, in terms of the character of the man. He's a fucking hard worker. Very minute detail in every little aspect of it. And one of the most shrewd politicians of his particular era. I mean, they called him the magician for a reason. I think it was Andrew Jackson who called him the magician, because it's fascinating, incredible that he was able to do the things that he was able to do. Anyways, he runs in the 1928 election in the gubernatorial race, and really just dominates. He won the actual election itself, and he was ready to just be the governor of New York, because he left the Senate, and he's ready. And I actually don't think he really thought Andrew Jackson was going to really do a lot of things for him. Although he doesn't understand that Andrew Jackson is a man of principle, and he's going to bring in the people that he trusts for the most part. And Martin Van Buren did quite literally everything to get him the office. So, nothing short of shooting someone, basically. So within like a couple of weeks of him actually being, the New York governor and having really a pretty sweet gig by all accounts for him, being the governor of New York is, it's a little bit different. It's actually a pretty powerful and influential opinion position for the most part. God, I can't speak right now. And within a couple of weeks, Andrew Jackson's like, "Hey, bruh, you want to be part of my cabinet? I need people in my circle of homies. You know what I'm saying, fam?" And Martin Van Buren's like, "Well, shit. I mean, can I be Secretary of State?" He's like, "Fuck it, do it." So Martin Van Buren effectively is now Andrew Jackson's Secretary of State. He resigns the governorship and goes back to Washington. And, you want to talk about a person with all the power, all the influence. There's no one that has more influence right now on the actual state of affairs in the world, in a sense, than Martin Van Buren in terms of what he could make America do, and okay, not the world, obviously. America's still very, very fundamentally isolationist, but you know what I mean. I'm over exaggerating a little bit. In fairness, I'm very tired, and I'm just trying to emphasize the importance of Martin Van Buren get the Secretary of Stateship. It's basically the equivalent of like the second number 2 for the most part, in terms of, because at this point the vice presidency isn't really anything, and it wouldn't be until Martin Van Buren loses his re-election, which I'll get to that in just a second and a little bit later. So Martin Van Buren's time as the Secretary of State's pretty fascinating. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty short because it's only 3 years of the entirety of Andrew Jackson's term. And, it's a very complicated period in time. So I'm going to be relatively brief and quick about his Secretary of Stateship and Vice Presidency. The meat of who Martin Van Buren is his presidency, and I think it's really fascinating. So first and foremost, he's Andrew Jackson's most trusted and closest advisor by a stretch, by miles and miles, and when there's problems and disputes within the actual cabinet itself, Andrew Jackson would hold his little cabinet meetings in the kitchen, be called the kitchen cabinet, and Martin Van Buren is there always, regardless, because Jackson at this point kind of doesn't trust Calhoun and a couple other people within his own cabinet due to the whole petticoat affair that would eventually happen. And it's interesting, he's basically in Andrew Jackson's ear most of the time. I mean, he's a big influence in a couple of the actual policies, foreign and domestic. The Maysville Roads Bill, of Henry Clay's. He's a big person and a fundamental believer in states' rights still. Not as much as Calhoun. Understand that. It's good. I'll explain that in just a second. But still, he's a fundamental states' rights person and is a big influence on why Andrew Jackson vetoed it. That and the whole, at least in terms of at least some aspects of foreign policy, he's a big reason why the French are paying their reparations and bills and to the actual country itself. And he's a pretty prominent Secretary of State, in this country's history. That being said, most of it, at least in Jackson's first term, is fundamentally dominated by politics, and Jack, like when I didn't really even go into this as much as I probably should have with Jackson in his first term, but in his first term, his cabinet from the get-go is fighting with each other, and I would say it technically starts with the whole petticoat affair, but it's really just partisan division, mainly between like Calhoun, Van Buren specifically. Because Calhoun is vehemently states' rights. If he could, he would just dissolve the federal government and create just this weird. He'd rather go back to the days of like the Articles of Confederation. And Van Buren, although he states' rights, is vehemently like, okay, I'm not that crazy, motherfucker, and that's why he and Jackson got along pretty well. And there's already division there. And Jackson already trusts Van Buren far more than he does Calhoun, even at this particular point in time. And, there's there's division growing between Calhoun and Van Buren, and they would just battle each other. And if at first it was political and arguments, personal divisiveness, and then personal stuff started really getting into the matter itself. Notably, the whole petticoat affair really started blowing up in people's faces, and a lot of these issues really start blowing up and just literally like in random places, like in the middle of actual cabinet meetings, sometimes in dinner banquets, like the annual Jefferson dinner banquet that they would always do. It always constantly happens where Calhoun basically just disavows Martin Van Buren, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And, Martin Van Buren is, carefully apolitical in a lot of aspects, in a lot of ways. Which is, in fairness, I think really difficult to assess his political ideology too, because, you don't really know what he's thinking, and we're kind of guessing what he's thinking about with just basically his writings for the most part. And I think it's fascinating because, the more that a lot of stuff happens within Jackson's cabinet, things just kind of occur, and he just stays out of it for the most part, except for things that really threaten the Union, even though the whole nullification crisis that would occur, I believe in 1832, 1833, was really because of him. But that's besides the point. Anyways, I'm getting way off topic here. During the actual cabinet discussions and debates, things start getting tense, and obviously it reaches a breaking point where, like, this whole petticoat affair and Peggy Eden, it cannot go on. It cannot continue like this. Otherwise, it will ruin any chance that he has at a re-election bid, because, the newly formed Whig Party, I guess you could say, is really kind of pushing for, hey, these guys are fucking clearly disorganized, regardless of them being state rights and fighting of the individual rights of liberties of the man, of like the common man. And Martin Van Buren realizing that at this point Jackson's the guy. That's his motherfucker. That's his homie. You know what I'm saying? That's his boy. And Martin Van Buren is the reason why most of his cabinet effectively retires or resigns from office. Because he goes up to Jackson, he's like, "Hey man, bruh, this shit can't go on, homie." And Jackson's like, "Hey man, I know. What do I do?" He's like, "Look man, how about this? I'll resign, and then, Mr. Eden will resign, and then we'll just go from there, fam." And he's like, "I don't know about that, fam." And he's like, "Trust me, this shit'll work, alright?" So, Martin Van Buren resigns as the Secretary of State in an act that basically kind of forces everyone else to resign, which basically just makes Jackson have a new cabinet, and then things kind of go back to normal, and Martin Van Buren's a little bit sad that he has to resign and leave the Secretary of State shit, but in doing so, he's basically given an opportunity for the most part to do what he kind of wants to do, and that's travel a little bit. Jackson, in the kind of like the weird deal that he makes, is basically like, "Hey man, if since you're gonna resign, what do you want to do?" He's like, "I want to go to Britain." Martin Van Buren's like, "I want to go to Britain, fam," and he wants to be the actual ambassador and minister to Great Britain itself. And he's apprehensive because he doesn't want to lose his best advisor, but he acquiesces, and he's like, "Hey man, all right, fam, I'll send you to Britain." All right, cool. And I think he actually does go to Britain at this particular point before he's actually confirmed by the Senate, and he's there for like, I think, at least 4 or 5, probably about half a year from 1831. Like, because as soon as he resigns, he ends up going straight to Britain. So he starts his ambassadorship, and he's getting close to and meeting a whole bunch of different people there. It's kind of cool. And then he gets a letter, and he's like, "Hey fam, you're not actually confirmed by the Senate because John C. Calhoun cast a tie-breaking vote as a last fuck you for the most part, at least in the Senate in his confirmation hearing." So Martin Van Buren a little bit disappointed that he's not really going to be the actual ambassador to Britain. But that actually showed a lot of things, and if Andrew Jackson was going to basically just dump Calhoun, that was like the pinnacle moment that he was going to dump Calhoun. So when Martin Van Buren comes back, Andrew Jackson's like, "Dude, Calhoun's a fucking dumbass, and he's going to regret it." So effectively John C. Calhoun ends up getting booted as Andrew Jackson's vice president, and Martin Van Buren ends up being asked, "Hey man, you want to be my vice president?" And he's like, "Well, it's not the Secretary of State, but fuck it, I'll take it, homie." And Martin Van Buren then becomes Andrew Jackson's vice president in his second term when he gets elected back into office. So now as vice president, what does Martin Van Buren do? He does whatever Jackson asks him to do. He's basically like Jackson Light in a lot of ways during during Andrew Jackson's presidency. I mean, he's there for everything. You know, the bank wars and opposition to the bank wars, anything that the Whigs do, etc., etc. I mean, he's Jackson's boy. He's the clear number 2 now at this particular point in time. He is the trusted advisor, and I mean, don't get me wrong. I think Jackson's bold, and he did a lot of things on his own, especially just random shit like paying off the national debt. But you know, Martin Van Buren was instrumental in giving him the I guess you could say the fundamental advice that would really help him for the most part. Like when Andrew Jackson's like, "Man, these motherfuckers are trying to cause a financial crisis." Martin Van Buren's like, "Hey man, I know, but we can do this. We got this. You know, stay true to your convictions, Mr. Jackson, my homeboy." And Jackson's like, "I got you." You know, he helped in a lot of those ways, just reaffirming his ideas, etc., etc., and you know, not backing down when you know things happened, unless it was clearly antagonistic to the reality itself of what things were going to be, and in a negative light. You know, like if civil war was going to occur, he was probably going to be, the one to acquiesce from that, you know, or at least abstain from a vote for, you know, things of that nature, like the nullification crisis, you know. I mean, don't get me wrong, the nullification crisis, he was 100% on Jackson's side, but he's like, I'd rather not go to war, though, so, you know, he was in a pickle, at least in that particular situation. Anyways, most of his vice presidency was founded upon, I would say, 3 things of note. First is the actual bank war itself, where, you know, he was so vehemently against. Well, okay, he was moderately vehemently against, and then once the actual national bank started, you know, once the reports came in about some of the actual, you know, financial problems and the financial dealings that were going on, and then, you know, the aggressive, antagonistic nature to Jackson, then he was like, oh, hell no, you know. And basically, you know, he just saw that the national bank just was a bit of a disadvantage to most Americans, and it only privileged a couple of people. I mean, he's a big reason why the bank war, for the most part, really fundamentally got pushed into the actual level that it actually did, you know. And don't get me wrong, he was apprehensive to a lot of things, you know, because he didn't think Andrew Jackson, you know, putting all the money and everything, I guess you could say all the little paper notes and whatnot into the actual state banks and stuff that would effectively be called pet banks. You know, he was a bit of a reservationist along with that, but at the same time, he hated the banks so much that he just said, "Fuck it, you know what? Do what you gotta do, Andrew. I'm not gonna stop you." So it was the bank. I would also just say the Whigs were becoming a party at this particular point. They were becoming a very fundamentally disorganized party, but a party nonetheless. And Andrew Jackson, and especially Martin Van Buren, during actual congressional matters, because he's Martin Van Buren. If you're the vice president, you lead the Senate, and he's leading the Senate like a motherfucker in every single opposition against the Whigs, and it becomes like a weird little political battle of ideologies between, I guess you could say, Henry Clay and then Martin Van Buren. They're just battling each other the entire time within the Senate itself, and it's actually pretty interesting. I don't want to get too deep into that because that's going to be a long time. But just to explain it very quickly and briefly, Martin Van Buren, God, they're so closely knit together. I keep getting them confused. But Martin Van Buren is just basically in opposition to Henry Clay and the eventual Whigs at every chance that they can get, you know, and they're winning, and they're still winning despite, you know, some losses in like the midterm elections, etc., etc. Because, like I said, the Whigs are a growing party, but they're an incredibly disorganized and dysfunctional growing party. Like I said before in the Andrew Jackson episode, was basically, you know, they're the Whigs are just the opposition party to Andrew Jackson, and that includes everybody, including slave owners, et cetera, and non-slave owners. And it's just when you align yourself with the ideology to be antagonistic to just one person, despite everything else probably being fundamentally different, it's gonna cause a lot of problems, and it's gonna cause a lot of issues, and ultimately it did. And I would say the final thing was Martin Van Buren trying to become president. First and foremost, I go back and forth whether I think he actually did want to become president, because I think he saw what it did to Andrew Jackson and was a little bit apprehensive to that. But, I also think, he wasn't going to be someone to back down from a challenge, if that makes any sense. And he hated the Whigs. He really just did not like the Whigs. And, you think Andrew Jackson had opposition. Obviously it wasn't going to be as much as Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson probably would have killed Henry Clay if he had the opportunity to be honest with you. But at the very same end of the spectrum, Martin Van Buren's basically like, this Democratic Party will stay strong, et cetera, and, we got to do everything we can. And it's very clear he's the number 2 guy. And in terms of the actual party itself, he's really unscathed for the most part, because most of the attacks are on Jackson. So he gets all the bonuses and all the pluses for being, aligned with Jackson in the positive way, but without the negatives where he's the one that's just generally not being attacked. So when he does announce his eventual presidential bid, Andrew Jackson obviously is like, it's my homeboy, y'all better vote for him, and the Whigs don't really have much to go off of it in terms of, negative press, et cetera, et cetera. They do find things, obviously, but, he's working towards his presidential bid, and I think most of it was just to stop and just continue the good times and the good things that were happening. Although it's very clear the signs, even to Martin Van Buren, were pretty clear of what would effectively be the downfall of his presidency, unfortunately, which would be, economic crisis and panics, et cetera, But nonetheless, he declares his candidacy for the presidency, and a little tip, he technically becomes the first vice president to be the one to try and actually succeed a president. And that's what I'm pointing out too. He's the first, and it's incredibly rare for things like of that nature to happen. The only other time it's ever happened in this country's history where a vice president succeeded the president that he was under was when George H.W. Bush did, and ironically, both of them would lose re-election the following election. But then, that kind of takes us in a lot of ways to the election of 1836, which is one of the most fascinating elections probably in this country's history that doesn't get talked about enough. And at this particular point in time, both parties are kind of just, they're set in a lot of ways, but one's far more organized and fundamentally united, and that's the key. They are fundamentally united at their core on values and principles. And say what you will about Andrew Jackson, but the guy, he had a support base, and people loved this man to death. And in a lot of ways, they were going to do whatever he wanted. And he just basically just vote for Martin Van Buren, just go from there, et cetera, et cetera. And he was prepared. He was ready. Martin was, because he had built himself up and positive press, et cetera, et cetera. And it's very clear that, he's Jackson's number 2 guy. He's much younger, much more capable. He's this man is ready to be president. And the Whigs, they're kind of all over the place. They're kind of a genuine shit show of, a whole bunch of different... It's complicated. But they have no direction during the entirety of Andrew Jackson's second term. And it's very clear that they have differing ideals and policies. And it depends on how you read it into it and look into it for the direction that they ended up going in. But 2 things. One, they knew that they were not united enough to actually defeat Martin Van Buren and Andrew Jackson's successor. Number 2, they felt also that there was just too much divisiveness within the actual party itself, and they weren't fully united. So the direction they ended up going in was trying to recreate the election of 1824. You see, their plan and their idea was, we'll put in like 4 or 5 fucking candidates that are Whig aligned, in hoping that they win their respective territories specifically. Enough of them will, that ultimately This leads to Martin Van Buren, despite winning a popular vote and maybe even more than likely the electoral vote, but not winning a majority. In which case, at that particular point in time, it'll go to the House and go to the Congress, and then just bam, we'll fucking kick him out, and Henry Clay will use his magic to, get all the states on his side, since Andrew Jackson's basically going to be out of the office. Biggest problem, though, is that, there's a viable candidate already for them, and had they just united behind him, probably would have swung the election, probably at the very least more in their favor. They probably would have lost regardless. But anyways, the election occurs, etc., and, the attacks, normal stuff would happen, and Martin Van Buren, is just vibing. He's chilling. He doesn't really have to do that much. He doesn't really campaign. He's much more of an old school politician, and that would be his downfall partially in the next election that I'll talk briefly about later. But for the most part, the actual election itself, the results, it almost works. It really does. It's a narrow victory for Martin Van Buren. He would win the majority of the electoral and popular vote. About, I think, 173 electoral votes and at least 50% of the popular vote. But I'm talking about it was razor thin margins. If one or two things go in a particularly different way and he doesn't win two key states, things go very differently. Very, very differently. William Henry Harrison, who would be the 9th president of the United States of America, actually was second. And like I said, in retrospect, had they actually just really pushed behind him as the actual viable candidate, much younger viable candidate, I don't know, things might have been different. Who knows? But at the very same time, this election brought on a lot of things. One, Martin Van Buren, technically speaking, becomes the first actual Democratic candidate. I would say the Democrats started when Andrew Jackson wins the election itself. So I would say he becomes the first Democratic candidate. Not only that, too, but with this particular election, it is very clear and solidified that the new second two-party system is fundamentally created. And now you have the Whigs, and now you have the Democrats. And in this particular election, the Democrats win, and Martin Van Buren becomes the 8th president of the United States of America. So what is America like when Martin Van Buren becomes president? Well, there's such a big economic boom, such a big economic push in this country that things are going great. Martin Van Buren probably could have just ran without the help of Jackson and probably still won just because of the economy itself. People were doing great. National debt zero, basically by the time Andrew Jackson leaves for the most part. There's no deficit, nothing. Everything is good, The actual industrial revolution, economic market revolution, transportation revolution, things are going very, very well in this country, and people are making a shit ton of money, and we are advancing at a high rate and speed, more so than we have been in recent years, I would probably say. And a lot of it has to do with Jacksonian policies, you could argue, yada, yada, but industries are booming. Industry is a booming. So things are going pretty good, which is unfortunate, which is very unfortunate for Martin Van Buren, because things are going pretty good, but the reality is that the problems that would occur with his presidency, which will be known as the Panic of 1837, that I'll get to in just a second. The signs are there, though. Banks, it's kind of like with the Great Depression a little bit. It starts with the small banks, little banks, and within banks on the outskirts, they start failing, and the next thing you know, it's the actual big city banks, and then the big city banks really start failing, and the next thing you know, bam, the stock market crashes, and in a lot of ways, the same exact thing will happen in the early goings of his presidency. That would lead to probably the worst financial depression until the actual Great Depression itself. And I will get to that in just a second. But anyways, when he comes into office, things are looking great. It's promising. On the outside, the Democrats are just strong. The economy's strong. And when he first came in, and in truth, a lot of people didn't really know what to make of Martin Van Buren, because for two reasons. One, he was, at the very least, because he's in the shadow of Andrew Jackson, a bit of an unknown. Everyone knew Calhoun in a lot of ways, but no one really knew Martin Van Buren. He kind of just came out of nowhere. It kind of just be like Pete Buttigieg, if he was working for Obama for how many years, and he comes in, it's like, oh, wow. that's a pretty bad example. But I guess what I'm trying to say is just in general, he's an outsider. No one knows really who he is. He's anonymous in a lot of ways. And number two is because, again, like I said, he's a bit apolitical. He's just is he just a states' rights person? And no one really knew what to make of him, because the people who did know him were basically like, he's a politically solid-minded individual, and it attempts to be objective, and everything, it goes all over the place in terms of how people view him. But for the most part, it's very clear that no one knows what he's thinking a lot of the time, and that's by choice and by, the way Martin Van Buren in a lot of ways really liked it. But things are good. Things are moving up, and things for Martin Van Buren are looking positively. And most people really do vote for him too, because a lot of people kind of just see him as this guy who's just going to continue Andrew Jackson's policies, And it's because it's kind of like with Poppy Bush a little bit, where it's like, well, it's just a continuation of the Reagan era. The main difference is that Poppy Bush wanted to be his own individual for the most part, and Martin Van Buren was very content with being Andrew Jackson's, successor, Andrew Jackson 2.0, and continuing a lot of the things. Most notably, the Indian Removal Act, and specifically the Trail of Tears, really being the actual part of the biggest part of the actual, Martin Van Buren's presidency was a lot of those things. So that's just America before Martin Van Buren becomes president. Let's talk about his cabinet. It's a very, I'll put it to you this way. I think it's pretty well put together for the most part, at least on the onset. He specifically and consciously chose people from different parts of the country for the most part. He wanted different voices, different opinions from other different people in different regions. He got someone from the north, south, the west, the Middle East, I guess you could say, with the Virginia people, and really was conscious in choosing a lot of people. I mean, notably, Levi Woodbury. He would be his actual Secretary of the Treasury and future Supreme Court Justice, because Polk, I believe, would appoint Levi Woodbury. And notably his Vice President, Richard Mentor Johnson. I just want to point out he was one of the most notable figures for being a man who had a slave technically as his common law wife, interestingly enough. And Martin had been a widow for most of Jackson's presidency, so he had his son, like I said before, Angelica, as a White House hostess, I guess you could say. You also have Martin Van Buren is fascinating too, because he would be I believe the last president to actually expand the Supreme Court with the Supreme Court Circuits Act of 1837. He would basically increase the size of the Supreme Court from 7 to where it is today, 9. And obviously some negotiations would attempt to try and expand the Supreme Court, but they all basically from this point on agree 9 is an optimum number. And he appoints 2 justices, where one seat Martin filled that was left over from the Jackson presidency, he gave to this guy named John McKinley, and then his other one would be Peter Vivian Daniel, where when a spot opened up, who would probably be, I guess you could say, the closest thing to a Federalist. Like I said, he chose a bunch of fascinating individuals, and he's a fascinating president. And it's little things like that about Martin Van Buren and a lot of his choices that lead me to believe that he's a big capitalistic mindset and someone who's loves a challenge, if that makes any sense. Which I absolutely admire about Martin Van Buren, because the guy, in particular, it would be Peter Vivian Daniel, who would actually be the biggest opposition to Chief Justice Taney, who was very just pro-states' rights, pro-slavery, very, very aggressively so, and really one of the just opposition voices in the entire Supreme Court system for the most part for the next 15 to 20 years that he would be on the actual court itself. So immediately at the start of his presidency in May, literally 2 months later into his presidency, banks begin suspending payments for speculation. This in turn, due to such a large volume of credit for speculation, basically slowly, I don't want to say slowly, very quickly collapsed the credit of the countries in general, which on top of that, there was already a small depression, I believe in England at this point in time, except because the price of cotton effectively just dropped for American Southern farmers when they're trying to export all their cotton. New England just wasn't buying it, so this led to much lower profits, grossly hyperinflated money, and the Panic of 1837 immediately really begins 6 months in full force after his initial presidency. And his presidential term begins, and it's literally one of the worst economic depressions in this country's history, one of the worst recessions in this country's history, and it's not helped by, unfortunately, because he's a fascinating president, because he is a firm believer in the Jacksonian ideals and policies. And he's so steadfast in basically just states' rights. The federal government is not going to intervene, that he basically probably just expedited it by being a strict Jacksonian principle kind of person, et cetera, which is ironic because I don't think Andrew Jackson would have let this go and let this occur. He wouldn't have let the people suffer in this particular way, But I also understand because he doesn't want to expand the powers of the federal government, et cetera. He would attempt to input, in his hopes, what would be the independent treasury that James K. Polk would really be the one to finally fundamentally implement. That would be, I guess you could say, the federal economic system in this country that would work pretty well. I would give him credit for, and a lot of the foundations and principles of the idea are made by Martin Van Buren. And it's unfortunate because most of his entire presidency is dominated by the Panic of 1837. So for the next 4 years, he's adamantly pushing this independent treasury, but Democrats keep losing seats, unfortunately, over time, and then it just becomes impossible for him to actually fundamentally implement his idea of an independent federal system of economics. So despite the economic crisis within the country that was going on at this particular point in time, the world itself, obviously not Great Britain and a couple other countries as well, this was a pretty staggering depression. Not just in America, but the world. It's a very fascinating time. Despite it, there is some technological advancement. Notably, the actual Samuel Morse, obviously from Morse code, his telegraph would actually get the patent, and it would be one of the first actual, long use, I guess you could say, transmission devices for communication. And it really would begin with Van Buren's presidency. Because I know John Tyler was a real big proponent of using the telegraph. Not to mention, too, Mr. What is his name? Louis Daguerre, whatever you want. Well, the first photographs, actual photographs, so I'm like nitrate and whatnot, the daguerreotype would actually be implemented very early, actually, in his campaign and come back to America. And, Martin Van Buren technically it was Andrew Jackson. Or no, it was John Quincy Adams, technically, who's the first, in terms of line of succession, et cetera, in terms of the presidency numbers, as the first president really to have their picture and photograph taken. Jan Jackson would be next, and Martin Van Buren is the next one on top of that as well. And, a lot of stuff ends up happening during this particular time. And, all over, like Charles Dickens, Charles Darwin started really gaining prominence. I think Charles Dickens would write Oliver Twist while he's, in the presidency. And, Charles Darwin's a real big proponent of his whole, I'm hitting shit for the most part. Studies in nature, et cetera, Queen Victoria is basically in full swing in England at this point in time. History is happening right now, people, is what I'm trying to say. And things are happening in not just the country, but the entire world that, I think is deeply fascinating and should also be fundamentally included. And let me just one more point on the actual depression before we actually move on. This would conquer genuinely his entire presidency from 1837 to this depression would actually last probably 1842, until John Tyler starts really fixing the economic problems within the country itself. he's a fascinating president that I can't wait to get to. But economically speaking, you should probably understand how bad it actually was. I've searched long and hard for the closest thing to hard numbers because, I don't think people were actively looking at, statistics when trying. I mean, they had a census back then, but, I don't know if they had the specific detail to go into everything. But at the really broadly speaking, if you're an economic, student or whatnot, and you're really into that shit, then, well, the closest thing I could find was an inflation rate close to about 14 to 15%, especially considering the fact that there's really fucking no credit. People were just broke as shit, and the government really needed to pay a whole bunch of debts off, unfortunately. And on top of that, about a 10 to 11% unemployment rate and an unemployment percentage, which, that sounds low in retrospect in comparison to the Great Depression, where, the peaks of the Great Depression were 25%. That's borderline, this country will falter in the next couple years kind of thing. So, but even like today, 10% would be fucking catastrophic, and that's incredibly economically damaging, especially in today's economy. But back then, that's catastrophic. And don't get me wrong, there was far less people in the country, but, when most of the men are working to support their families, if 10% of them can't really function, feed, and support their family, that is a big, big fucking problem. And a lot of people did not like the Democrats for effectively just allowing, and it wasn't the fact that they weren't helping, it was the fact that big business was really the ones that were secure, and that they weren't helping, obviously for a whole bunch of different reasons, but they weren't keeping them on tap, or at the very least, them honest in how their fucking dealings were, because, big business, for the most part, is just trying to cut everything that they possibly can in order to function and survive and not falter as a company. But, in a lot of ways, this is where, like, the beginnings of, like, the progressive movements really start stemming from. In some ways, it doesn't really go into full swing, I would probably say, until the late 19th century, probably like the 1890s, late 1890s, like really late. And because in the previous administration, actually in like the previous years, Andrew Jackson would be the one to quell some of the first notable strikes within this country's history, and Martin Van Buren is basically just a continuation of what's ultimately happening, and doing things like that don't make you really look good as a president. And then on top of that, the Trail of Tears really ends up being a big problem for Martin Van Buren in 1837. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. The fundamental point I'm trying to make is that, the seeds of him losing re-election badly, they are starting now. So what else happens other than economic crisis during Martin Van Buren's presidency? Basically, almost potential war numerous times. First and foremost, Martin Van Buren is the first president to really get the crack at a annexation of Texas, I guess you could say, the Texas thing, because the Alamo occurred in the latter part of Andrew Jackson's presidency, and although he basically, was rooting for annexation of Texas, he wasn't, he didn't really get a crack at it ultimately, in terms of really annexing Texas, because it was too late into his term, and it was going to be a bit of a hassle, and he just let Martin Van Buren deal with it. And Martin Van Buren was a very vehemently against annexing Texas, and I'll explain that later, but it would actually be the big downfall of him getting the nomination for the Democratic Party later on in the election of 1844. And he basically did everything he possibly could to avoid the issue entirely, even though it was very clear that first off, if he annexed Texas, two things would occur that he did not want to occur, and that was war with Mexico and the expansion of slavery in the southern states for the most part. Now, economically, it would actually probably be very beneficial, and because soon after the him basically saying no to annexing Texas, he's calling upon Congress to do the whole independent treasury thing, and debates kind of rage on about how it was, and I would probably argue that they wouldn't do his independent treasury thing at the very least until he annexed Texas, because it seems like a very win-win situation for the economic health of this country. But on a moral ground and foundation, Martin Van Buren was not going to do it. He's like, no, y'all, you're going to yeet this fucking Texas away from us, get it away from us, et cetera, et cetera. Understand too that the westward expansion is still happening. I think Michigan becomes a state very, very early on in his presidency. So it's not about territory itself. It's about specifically Texas, what it represents, and it being below the whole Missouri Compromise line too. So there's a whole bunch of different things that all coincide with him saying no. But it's not just Texas. Fucking British. I swear to God, it's the fucking British. Tensions are rising again in very late 1837, early 1838. Specifically, the British in Canada. There's disputes on territory. There's no solid line where Maine is and New York and a lot of the northern territories and like Michigan, Indiana, and Canada at this point still a British colony. Which is fascinating because, British had colonies in Canada too, but they didn't fight in the Revolution. I think that's a very fascinating story that we don't really think about, but I would just want to point that out for people. There's disputes in territory, okay? And it reaches a point where British start capturing ships, and it really reaches the apex when they captured the ship Caroline, where it just injures a whole bunch of different Americans. It creates a bit of an international stir, and Martin attempts to remain neutral as humanly possible. Canada, like I said before, being a colony of Great Britain. And this spread far more so into, I would say, Michigan and Ohio, but the main apex of the actual conflicts itself, ultimately, it would get resolved later on, but for the most part, it's beginning here, for the most part. And then, for obvious reasons, again, like I said before, the majority of the Indian Removal Act really occurs under Martin's presidency. And in Martin's presidency is ultimately when, sorry, I'm taking my mask off, is where the actual Second Seminole War really goes into full bore, for the most part. And eventually it would actually be him to complete the whole Indian Removal Act in 1838 too, but it would lead to the Trail of Tears, unfortunately, when they're getting rid of everybody from the actual Florida territory itself and moving them west. Also, I want to note too, again, like I said before, the abolition movement is growing within this country. I'm talking about very growing. They're trying to start their own party, the Liberty Party. And John Quincy Adams is like the one in the House that's really annoying a shit ton of people because of the whole, abolition movement, and whatchamacallit, the Amistad case would happen during his presidency, I believe, or at the latter part of his presidency, I think around 1838 through 1840. I forgot what year it was specifically off the top of my head. A lot of things are happening during his presidency that everything is just coinciding with one another. So I would probably say the second half of his presidency, it's really Mexico and, again, the economy for the most part. He kind of lets everything else go about what they're going to go, because the disputes with the British ultimately would continue. They would heighten, but Martin would basically arbitrate and become... Basically, he would effectively be the president to establish the borders, I think, of New York and Maine by the end of his presidency. To I think where they're at today, but I'm not sure if I forgot if there's another legislation that actually fixed the borders of Maine and New York. But I believe he's the one that actually finally settled that dispute with Great Britain and Canada. Most of his presidency for the second half is really devoted to Mexico and the economy. Because, again, the economy after 3 years, it's only just getting worse. It goes up and down and fluctuates despite, the economic growth going back to Britain. America is still fundamentally struggling, you know, and it really was a bit of a problem because he didn't stop any of the Jackson policies, notably the whole speculate circular policy of basically only paying gold and silver in land speculation instead of banknotes, you know, and it was still really difficult. And it would be a while before that actually gets taken away. And with Mexico's worried because they're like, hey, if you take Texas, that's ours, you know, and they're in Texas and Mexico just fighting each other vehemently, and Martin's just trying to stay neutral. He's just trying to basically be like, hey, man, is there any way you guys can, like, not do anything, like, not go to war with Texas because, you know, we might want to annex them later, you know, obviously he doesn't say that, but he's talking about, you know, getting Texas fundamentally independent, not in the Union, but fundamentally independent, you know, so it's its own, like, sovereign nation for the most part. That's what he's trying to fight for, you know, fascinatingly. I would also point out, too, the Whigs during the entirety of his presidency. The Whigs kind of have it easy because during this particular time, they're very quiet. And not quiet, but for the most part, they figured out the problems with, you know, the first election of the actual Whig candidates, and you know, let's just get behind William Henry Harrison and kind of just go for it, you know, because they're sitting back, they're enjoying themselves. They regained a lot of seats within the House and the Senate, and Martin Van Buren's presidency is going to be similar to, unfortunately, John Quincy Adams, where not a lot of things get done, and the country kind of suffers in a lot of ways for it, unfortunately, with partisan politics. But ultimately, Martin Van Buren taking his specific choices, being strong in his specific choices, which is ironic for the man who ultimately was very, you know, unpolitical for a lot of reasons, or neutral in so many aspects, you know, basically taking aggressive stands in many ways, shapes, and forms that ultimately would ruin his presidency. And the Whigs, they're chilling, they're vibing, you know, but the country at this particular point, it's still pretty strong on the Democrat, you know, despite them winning a lot of seats, you know, there's still a bit of a fundamental divide between the North and the South, in terms of who's going to win the presidency. And like I said, if you win the South and the West, you win the presidency. And you know, that's why the Whigs chose William Henry Harrison and really pushed for him to become president. But also, fundamentally, you know, they didn't like the South and West did not functionally believe yet that they were going to be good enough to really do anything that was specifically going to change things for the better, you know, despite William Henry Harrison being a slave owner, et cetera, et cetera. You know, it was more so about, hey, what are you going to do for us, you know, yada, 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 yada. And are you going to do something so different but also allow us to have our states' rights? Because at the very least, they're basically just like, okay, so he's not overstepping boundaries fundamentally. You know, he doesn't want to expand slavery, but you know what? He's also not trying to trample on us. And the Whigs, by all accounts, are effectively that nationalistic party. So no one's going to want to vote for them, no matter how bad the economy is at this particular point in time. So, you know, there's really no other option for the Whigs to really do anything to really win the South. So they do two things. They get John Tyler, a former Democrat who's now a Whig, as William Henry Harrison's vice president, and they just start touring, and they start campaigning, and they start doing the actual first genuine presidential campaign. And I'm going to go more into it when I do William Henry Harrison fundamentally and John Tyler. And, you know, they have their own saying, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. And Martin Van Buren, around 1838, 1839, is like, fuck, what the hell, guys? Like they're just, because, you know, it was kind of taboo for people to campaign at that particular point in time. And it was just like, no one had ever done that. It was basically just other people, you know, campaigning for you. But them going out on the road, John Tyler giving speeches and shit, it's just like, whoa, things are happening. And Martin Van Buren would stay home and not campaign whatsoever, which in a lot of ways was negative in his downfall. But, you know, he was too principled, unfortunately, to do anything else. So for the most part, most of his presidency is just dealing with Mexico, the economy, failing him in a lot of ways, both those things. And then eventually his failed attempt at a presidential re-election. You know, they try and do the same thing, like I said before, nickname being OK, old Kinderhook, the OK term. When we say A-OK, it's like good old, we're you know, Kinderhook's all good, you know, et cetera, you know. And it was just a bit of a downfall. Ultimately, his presidency in the last couple of years the writing was on the wall, but he was not going to give up. So I give him credit for that. But the election was something that he was never going to win, and he would effectively lose that presidency, and in what would effectively be the first grassroots presidential effort to try and win the election itself successfully with William Henry Harrison. They effectively just gave up. They were just tired of it. They were exhausted with Martin Van Buren and his lack of trying to get anything done for the most part. Because, they wanted to give him a chance. He was a supporter of states' rights. He, for the most part, aside from Texas, really allowed people to do whatever the fuck they wanted to do. But at the same time, 4 to 5, effectively 4 years of horrible economic depression and a whole bunch of different problems. It's not going to be it's not very conducive for anyone to actually succeed. So Martin loses his re-election. He loses pretty badly, both in certainly the popular vote and at least by about 70 electoral votes, 80 electoral votes. And it was very clear from the get-go. Despite Martin really kind of rising in popularity in a lot of ways, it just was not in. It was just not in the stars, in the writing, for the most part, for Martin Van Buren to become president. So, how do you even assess his presidency? Because, in fairness, I think it's difficult to assess presidents who have to do and deal with economic crises for the most part. But at the very same time, this might sound bad, but it's kind of like with Obama a little bit, where it's like, despite the economic crisis, I think I can astutely and fundamentally at least kind of assess your presidency, because if you do things that are going to negatively affect the economy, and that they're going to negatively affect the economy, you still do them, that's a problem. And Martin Van Buren is one of these particular individuals that would go about doing so. And I think that should obviously be, looked down upon in a lot of ways. That being said, what is he to functionally do when he's trying to go about doing what he believes is right? He's and it's fascinating, because I think he wants to and attempts to be fundamentally one of the more principled presidents we ever had in this country's history. One of the most brilliant in a lot of ways too, which is unfortunate, because I think if he didn't have an economic crisis, things would probably be different. But then again, I'm not a fortune teller, and I don't think we should be going down that pathway, and just look at it for what it is, And it's just one individual who was a great politician, but was he capable of being president? I don't think he fundamentally was. But then again, if he had gotten another opportunity to become president, like had he won the nomination for 1844 and beat Henry Clay, maybe we would look back on revisionist history and just say maybe things were a little bit different, And who knows? But there's only, if I'm going to be 100% honest, one way to look at his presidency, and that's just an abject failure. Despite, what positive feelings I might have about Martin Van Buren, it is undeniable that a lot of the things that he did, a lot of the policies that he implemented, fundamentally principled to keep the rights of man for the most part and not grossly expand the federal government, ultimately did more harm than good. And no matter what level of negotiating skills he could with Mexico, et cetera, with the Congress, he was always just genuinely and unfortunately set up to fail. And I think it should be noted that despite him being an abject failure, there was everything that could go wrong went wrong for Martin Van Buren. And that should at least be noted. So what does Martin Van Buren do after he leaves the presidency? Well, first and foremost, I understand that he is the first president to lose a re-election bid that's not last name Adams. So it's a little bit devastating and really embarrassing, unfortunately, for him. So, he takes a break from politics, and he effectively never rejoins the actual federal political scene for the most part. He doesn't hold any serious political office effectively for the rest of his life. But he does stay a part of and influences Democratic politics for basically the next decade and a half or so. Because he's still youngish for the most part and active and capable for the most part. So in a lot of ways, he's still eyeing an opportunity to become president. And he watches the political scene. He has meetings with some people who visit him on the estate, influences some policies. while he's still lost, he's still influential. I mean, he really starts renovating his home because he has this beautiful house that's like 36 rooms. And he enjoys time with his family, grandkids, etc., etc. And despite being influential, he's really just enjoying retirement, enjoying life. He starts traveling a little bit, gets to see some people, gets to see some sights, and is really just chill. He's vibing. You know what I'm saying, homie? Like, he's vibing himself, And for him, he's really just waiting for a chance, an opportunity, and because when he loses, it's 1840. He's kind of eyeing 1844 as a potential opportunity for him to get another shot at being president. There's no clear-cut candidate, to be honest, at least for the Democratic nomination. I mean, ultimately, they would eventually, figure out with James K. Polk, but would become the first dark horse candidate. But literally, there's really no one, for the most part, for the election of 1844. So with Tyler clearly being a failure, the only real opposition he has is Calhoun as the actual potential, because Calhoun's putting his name in the ring too, and they still fucking hate each other, so they're fucking gore and guts. And Van Buren's really actually taking the lead in the initial Democratic nomination proceedings at the actual Democratic convention, because he threw his name in the ring and he's like, hey, I'm going to do this, etc., etc., I'm all for this, etc., etc. And his big miscalculation was his steadfast antagonistic approach to annexation of Texas. It had been a while, and at this particular point in time too, he's effectively a bit of an abolitionist himself, and he's just, I'm not for Texas at all, which unfortunately the Democratic Party itself was very, very much against. That ultimately was the miscalculation that cost him a ring. The ring, I guess you could say, and the chance to effectively become the Democratic nominee. And unfortunately, because of that left the Democrats in a bit of a hole, because a lot of people assumed that he was going to be, the guy that was going to get the nomination, and the next thing you know, he's president again, or potentially president again against Henry Clay. And it's kind of poetic in a lot of ways, where it's like Henry Clay, Martin Van Buren again, Jackson 2.0 versus the guy, the Claymeister, and it put the Democrats in a bit of a funk. But because it opened up everything, and no one could decide on anything, in which case James K. Polk effectively becomes the president of the United States and the Democratic nominee, or the Democratic nominee and then the president of the United States. After this, Martin Van Buren's kind of getting old. He basically goes along with Jackson for the most part in terms of voting for James K. Polk, and once he fails in the nomination, he's just like, all right, fuck it, let's go for it, let's go James K. Polk. And, many things were occurring around this particular time with, the Democratic Party, the war with Mexico. People were fractured, I guess you could say. The Northern Democrats were really for Martin Van Buren, obviously, and the abolitionist movement. The fundamental problem with the Democratic Party, unfortunately, is that, and the Whig Party, too, to an extent, was just the weakness and the fracturing overall. There's no party stability whatsoever in both parties around this particular point in time, which is a little bit unfortunate. The Whigs would eventually fold and then coalesce into the actual Republican Party, and then the Democrats ultimately would just falter in a lot of ways. And the Northern Democrats would effectively become the new Republicans because they were abolitionists, although they were fundamentally states' rights. And, a lot of those people would end up becoming Republicans, and, history is fascinating, isn't it? But for the most part, Martin Van Buren, also being a Unionist, he would effectively become he would basically be a Republican by the time the Civil War occurs. Note, too, Martin Van Buren lives a very, very long time. But effectively, once 1844 occurs, he's reaching a pretty ripe age in terms of, even attempting to become president. So once 1844 fails, he effectively fails at his last opportunity to become president. And, like I said, a lot of things are happening. The parties begin splintering, and Martin Van Buren officially, for the most part, effectively retires in a lot of ways from politics. At the very least, he's very just apolitical at this particular point. There's nothing that he can do that's going to really influence anything in particular. He's still influential in New York politics, actually very much so. That he's on the side of the abolitionist movement, the anti-slavery people. They would call themselves the barn burners in New York, and they're the ones that are basically just trying to start another new attempt at a third party, known as the Free Soil Party. And they were basically just the anti-slavery party. So if you voted them in, they were going to be anti-slavery. These would again be the precursors for the Republican Party. And the nomination, he would get the nomination for the most part to be part of the Free Soil Party, and he'd only get about 10% of the actual popular votes. And Zachary Taylor would effectively become president. They actually took some votes away from the Democratic nominee for the most part, because like I said, the split between the actual Democratic Party allowed the Whigs to capitalize on that particular thing. But I'll explain that when I get to Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore and all of them for the most part. After that election, Martin Van Buren, what was that? The election of 1848. So Martin Van Buren's close to about in his mid-60s. He's getting old, and he really just gives up. He's just like, I'm getting too old for this shit, and he really retires from politics, really. And he would throw his hand in the hand occasionally within, some politicals, people for the most part. I'm going to vote for this person, and influence politics in that particular way, shape, and form. But like I said, he visits people, he enjoys stuff, and it's kind of fascinating because there's a couple stories of like Martin Van Buren when he travels, especially around Europe for the most part too. I think and the world, mainly in Britain. He's this older guy at this particular point in time, and they kind of don't recognize him. And I think it would just be funny to be in Britain, walking down the street, and next thing you know, it's like, oh, isn't that Martin Van Buren? Who's Martin Van Buren? He's the 8th president. I wouldn't have fucking known that, and it's fascinating to think about, when things like that occur, and anyways, he lives for quite a long time. He lives until 1862, so he effectively lives close to, I would probably say, his 80s. He lives to be about 80 actually, and he visits Britain. He endorses Democrats up until about the point of Civil War, in which he's all about the Union and abolition, and supporting the Union during the Civil War. He's the oldest member at that particular point in time, when James Buchanan's calling upon people to be like, hey man, we gotta support this Union, so all the old presidents, come in and fucking support this motherfucker. He's the oldest, because Jackson's gone at that point, and Henry Harrison's gone. Tyler dies actually Tyler dies around the exact same time, but he's for the Confederacy, etc., etc. And James K. Polk dies like 3 months out of office, so he effectively becomes the elder statesman for the most part when the actual Civil War occurs. He supports the Civil War and supports the Union during the Civil War. And on July 24th, he ends up dying of pneumonia, and dying specifically of bronchitis and heart failure, unfortunately, in Kinderhook. And again, he outlived all 4 of his immediate successors, which I want to say is just very deeply fascinating for the most part. What do you make of Martin Van Buren? To be honest, I don't know. And to be honest, this episode probably seems like a bit of a shit show in normal comparison to some of the other episodes I tend to do. And it's because Martin Van Buren, he's a puzzle in a lot of ways. A lot of these presidents really are puzzles in their own way, shape, and form. And for Martin, it's just he's wearing a mask most of the time that he's actually president. He's a very difficult person to really parse, because you really just don't know. He's kind of like Washington in that particular way, shape, and form. And not so much like Jefferson. Jefferson basically showed you everything, and it was just difficult to really figure out that puzzle when you have all the pieces. But for Martin Van Buren, you don't really have the pieces in a lot of ways, shape, and form. I would probably say most of his entire life, if I'm going to be honest with you, he's always been like an abolitionist type person, always been someone who believes in the rights of the individual regardless of your race, creed, or code, and et cetera, et cetera. And, I don't even know if it's like revisionist history when it comes to explaining or understanding Martin Van Buren. He and his family may have been a slave owner, but he himself wasn't. And, I look at him and I see this guy who created the Democratic Party, and I find him just fascinating because, what the Democratic Party would become, even today, it's nothing like, for the most part, what Martin Van Buren, I believe, really envisioned the Democratic Party fundamentally being, maybe in the states' rights organization to impose the Democratic Republican Party and, eventually the Whigs and the future Republicans. But it wasn't anything like what it would become, what it had become, and what's become now. I feel like you'd be pretty horrified for what the actual Democratic Party has become, probably in the last, decade or so. Actually, just in general, of what, his political party has fundamentally become. In a lot of ways, I think what Martin Van Buren probably envisioned in terms of an actual political party is probably the modern-day Republican Party. And I think that's really fascinating to think about and to parse, Martin Van Buren was a good man. A good man that history tends to just kind of not look fondly upon because of his failures as a president, and being the creator of the Democratic Party that would eventually be the party that would succeed from the Union, unfortunately. And, history doesn't look fondly on people in terms of, at the very least, when, because he is a fundamental reason why I'm also doing an episode like this, and I'm doing this series, is because, is it fair to put that on him? Is it fair to really say, Martin Van Buren, your failure as a man and as a president because X, Y, and Z? Because when you look at things objectively and you have all the facts that you can find, peruse, etc., you get a much more honest picture of it. And the truth is that, it's never succinctly because of just one particular person. Just like with any other presidents, you work as a team. You work with other people. You work with fucking Congress to do shit and get things done. The whole point of the president is to do what is basically supposed to be asked of you, for the most part, with the powers that you're given, And then you have to understand that the executive in chief doesn't have that power. That's why everyone was freaking out about Andrew Jackson for the most part, because he grossly expanded the federal powers and the executive power that a president can have. Sorry, some guy with a small dick driving around with a Mustang trying to rev his engine. Anyways, what I'm trying to say is that, he wasn't going to be that barn burner kind of person, although he basically would be the barn burner presidential candidate. That would be the abolition movement. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that he's not going to be one to... He understands power. I think he understands that very well. He understood that at a very young age, You look at a man who's basically fundamentally been in politics his entire life, arguably speaking. He grew up with it. He grew up with it, and then he worked in it for the most part. He's embedded into it. And I think he understood politics in its fundamental point and fundamental, I guess you could say, reasons, and fundamentally just understood the basic foundations of what it meant to succeed in the political game and the political sphere. Does one succeed as a president, though? Does one succeed as a leader? And I think in this series I'm trying to figure out what makes a good leader, what makes a good president, because every single presidency is very different. Every single president in person is fundamentally flawed and not terrible in their own way, shape, and form, Like, does a president, need to be a good leader? Does a president need to do X, Y, and Z? Like, I'm finishing up my super deep dive on Reagan right now, and I look at Reagan, and I've always been like a Reagan fan, but, I look at Reagan and he's pretty basic, intellectually speaking. He's basically just anti-communist and a whole bunch of other stuff, obviously. But does that make him a terrible president? No. In fact, he was probably the right person at the right time in a particular time and era that would effectively end communism. And sometimes I think some people are just at the wrong place at the wrong time. And I'm not saying Martin Van Buren's a good leader or anything like that, but I will say that, Martin Van Buren had everything going wrong for him when he became president and during his political time and era. He's so much more suited for the old school founding father days of the actual presidential, life, I guess you could say. If he was an actual politician much earlier in the national scene, had he maybe attempted to go into state politics a little bit earlier, had he probably even been like a nominee earlier, things might have been a little bit different had everything stayed the same, It's unfortunate. Martin Van Buren is a little bit like John Quincy Adams in some way, shape, and form, where he's kind of a man lost in time in some ways and aspects of, because he grew up in the old school politics and the whole old school political scene, and he adapted well to the new school political scene, but he also kept a lot of the same fundamental principles that ultimately would effectively fail him in the new political scene of the political arena, both eventually as a politician later on, post-presidency, and then his presidency itself. Old Kinderhook. He is, in my opinion, still the first politician president that we've ever had. And it's fascinating because I tend to not like politicians, to be brutally honest with you. And he's one that I fondly have a much deeper appreciation for, more than I think I ever thought I would have, and for the better. Martin Van Buren is a good man. Martin Van Buren, by all accounts, is someone that history is kind of sleeping on, And I think it's unfortunate. And it's unfortunate because, American history is just filled with a shit ton of politicians and people that once you really have a deeper dive look at, it's fascinating. These people are incredible and they do a lot of things. And Martin Van Buren is one of these particular individuals that will never really get the credit, I think, that he deserves for a lot of the good and the bad that he's done in terms of the actual political influences that he was able to do in this country's future. So I guess that just begs the question, how should we remember Martin Van Buren? I don't think we should remember him as someone that's a failure. I think we should remember him as someone that's unfortunate in every sense of the word. Unfortunate. A man of insecurities his entire life, losing his wife at a really young age and being a widow, and he was a man that just kept everything bad that could happen to him, especially very young, and a lot of failures, just ended up being bad and happened to him. But he always rose above the occasion, and he always rose above all else because it was the right thing to do, because he was principled, because he was going to succeed above and beyond, at least for the most part, and be the man and be the president, for the most part, that this country really, well, at the very least, in his personal opinion, on how to actually run the executive branch, what the country, he believed, needed. He's not a perfect man. And if anything, he's the prime example of this experiment that I'm doing, as he believed the American experiment and the American dream and all that stuff was to succeed with the two-party system, And again, by no means a perfect person, but someone that I think if we look back on objectively, fairly, we won't see him as a failure, but we will see him as someone that always rose above all else, rose above everything, and rose above anyone, and rose above all the trials and tribulations to succeed. It's him and Jackson that are the true, I think, fundamental American stories. Men with modest means that grow up from really nothing. They're given a couple opportunities, and next thing you know, they take every chance that they can get, and they reach the highest office in this country's history. And that's Martin Van Buren. That's old Kinderhook, the magician, etc., etc. I want to give him another nickname, the Flying Dutchman. Martin Van Buren is not a failure. He's an American. He's one that falls many, many times, but you know what? He'll just keep rising, and he'll keep trying. And you know what? One day, he'll succeed. Thank you guys for listening. Hope you guys tune in for the next episode.